My name is Rebecca O'Neill. I work for Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. We're so pleased to be able to offer this event in partnership with Sandia National Laboratories and support of the Office of Electricity's Energy Storage Program. Please take a look at the agenda listed on the website. We'll pop that into the chat for you now. The website includes the agenda, several reader memos to help orient you to some of these materials, bios for all of the panelists and all of the featured speakers we have to offer you. And we also have a little bit more of the slides and other things that we'll be posting there after the event. You probably noticed that this event is being recorded. We do want to be able to capture all of the thoughts here. And for you as participants to the webinar, that means that you mostly are going to be able to communicate with us through chat. So we really encourage you to take a look at the chat function. If you have questions during the event that you would like to see incorporated into one of the panels, we'll do our best to do so live as we can. If you have any IT issues, also please use the chat function and someone will reach back out to you through that. I want to welcome you as someone who's kind of the facilitator of the event. But I really want to take this moment to pass the baton over to Imre Zsuk. Dr. Zsuk is the Director of Energy Storage Research at the Office of Electricity, and he's going to offer our first welcome to the event. Dr. Zsuk?
Well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to finally have the roundtable running. It's taken us a couple of weeks, well, actually a little bit longer, to prepare for it and to make sure that it's properly socialized and that we find good panelists. And we are very proud of what we put together. And I thank Rebecca in particular and all our friends at Sandia and PNNL for putting together this excellent Energy Storage for Social Equity Roundtable. Welcome.
Thank you, Imre. I think now we can open up the event. Thank you to those of you who are chatting and welcoming to each other. It's wonderful to see that. And yes, it is really hot here in Portland where I'm based. I think we're all kind of living the experience that we're here to talk about. So Imre, I think the next step is to segue into our welcome remarks from Secretary Granholm, who is the Secretary of Energy. Could we move to that, please?
Indeed. It's now our honor to welcome Secretary Granholm, who has pre-recorded a message for us. Secretary Granholm has emerged a strong advocate for both energy storage and social equity, and we are happy to have her supportive remarks.
Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable on energy storage for social equity. I want to start by saying I am so proud to be part of an administration that has really made equity its North Star in really everything that we do. It's the value that we are using to guide and to measure all of our investments, especially here at DOE. I like to call DOE America's Solutions Department because our work is all about tackling some of these very tough challenges, the nation's toughest challenges, and doing so in a way that brings real and tangible benefits to American families. These would be solutions that, for example, keep their lights on or make their bills cheaper or make their children healthier, and solutions that bring more prosperity and opportunity to communities. So that is why I'm just so excited about our role in leading America through the clean energy transition, because it promises to bear out all of these solutions and so much more. We want this revolution to reach people in every pocket of the country, because what's more important to us than how many people it reaches is who it reaches. As you all know, so far, too many communities that have been left behind are still going unseen, and they should be at the front of the line. Communities of color that bear the brunt of our nation's pollution, whose children can't breathe without an inhaler. Low income communities that pay far too much for their energy, or tribal communities that aren't even connected to the grid, or fossil fuel communities that are standing on the edge of this transition. And all too often, these are the same communities that are getting hit first and worst by the climate crisis. And we just have to change that. So at DOE, we're using President Biden's Justice 40 initiative to guide our course, which commits 40% of the overall benefits of our climate and clean energy investments to these communities that should now be at the front of the line. So my advisor for equity, Shalonda Baker, the great Shalonda Baker, she is helping us to reimagine how we're designing and how we're developing and how we're deploying these clean energy solutions to right these historic wrongs. We've already gotten the ball rolling on solar equity with millions in new funding to support deployment in underserved communities, and a request for information to solicit feedback on how we can improve access. And of course, today, we're setting our sights on energy storage because it is inherently designed with the goal of making cheap and clean power available to everyone when they need it. And that's one reason why it's on our short list of technologies for which we want to accelerate breakthroughs. Energy storage technologies can be deployed in urban areas, in rural areas, and areas that draw their energy from solar or wind or geothermal, you name it. And these storage technologies can help to power vulnerable communities through these extreme weather events that we have been seeing. This energy storage technologies can make sure that first responders remain available during these outages and emergencies. And when storage is coupled with other grid solutions, they can even replace fossil fuel plants and bring cleaner and healthier air to the communities that surround them. So as we prepare to seize the massive opportunities ahead for energy storage, we need folks like you at the table. We need you guiding our plans. We need you helping us to identify our blind spots. We need advocates who can help us to shape a future where every family can see and feel the benefits of the clean energy transformation. So I know that you have a fantastic couple of days of discussion ahead of you. I want to thank you for letting me dip in and be a part of it. I hope you have a great event.
Thank you, Secretary Granholm. We will try to carry out the agenda, and we'll do our best. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Michael Pessin, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Advanced Grid Research and Development Division in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity. He holds a master's degree in electrical engineering from St. Petersburg State Polytechnic. He comes to DOE from Seattle City Light, where he has developed technology strategy, managed R&D projects, and directed a lot of cutting-edge work. And now he's with DOE and continuing his good work in managing the rest of us to do good work as well. Michael.
Thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. And thank you for having me here today. So actually, I just got off from the meeting with the secretary, and we were talking about what DOE can do to accelerate the deployment of the energy storage. And as you can tell from Energy's speech, she's very excited and very enthusiastic about energy storage. So this is one of the top priorities of the DOE right now. So there will be a lot of activities. I'll talk about some of them, but stay tuned. You'll see a lot of new announcements coming soon. But to start with, I want to tell you something that you already know. So having abundant, clean, and modernized, secure, resilient, reliable grid is extremely critical to the administration's clean energy goals. And what we need to do, we need to be able to move cheaper, cleaner electricity, not only where it needs to go, but to when it needed. So we can't do it without energy storage. Since 2017, DOE has invested approximately over $1.2 billion in storage research. That's about 400 million a year. And as we move to the future with a wider array of energy options than we ever had before, we need to integrate all these new technologies it is increasingly important. Energy storage is one of the most important ways to do this. But there are challenges, right? So we need a longer duration energy storage. We need to have storage that will cover 8 hours, 12 hours to provide support to the grid that it will need. We need to be strategic about thinking about planning, sizing, placement, valuation, societal, environmental impacts. All this is extremely important. It is also important to recognize that energy storage technologies have very wide range. It's electromechanical, mechanical, thermal, flexible generation, flexible buildings. It requires power electronics well beyond that often referenced as battery storage. So we're going far beyond of what many people talked about in the past and equating energy storage with batteries. So batteries are very important, but it's not only about batteries. There's other technologies that need to be considered. And to succeed at this, we need to look at all different kinds of energy storage solutions. So in early 2000, DOE announced the ESGC, Energy Storage Grand Challenge. So this is a very comprehensive program that leverages the unique, extensive expertise and capabilities of the department and our national labs. And with this initiative, we want to really push the envelope when it comes to developing next generation energy storage. So the energy storage challenge roadmap outlines one key target. So the target is to have 5 cents per kilowatt hour levelized cost of storage for long duration stationary applications. And it's a 90% reduction from 2020 baseline costs. And we want to accomplish this by 2030. So it's very ambitious goals, but this is what we put into this initiative. And achieving this levelized cost target would facilitate commercial viability for storage across the wide range of users. Also, you probably already know that in March, we announced the start of design and construction of this 75 million grid energy storage research and development facility at PNNL called Grid Storage Launchpad, or GSL. And the purpose of this is to expand battery R&D capabilities. And this facility will be more than 85,000 square feet and include 30 research labs, some of which will be testing chambers capable of systematic and independent validation and testing of new grid storage technologies. It can test anything from basic materials and components to prototype devices. And all this testing will be done under realistic grid operating conditions. Construction will begin very soon, as I think later this year is expected, and with the building operational and ready for occupancy as soon as 2025. And you've heard Secretary talking about energy justice. So energy storage is very useful and helpful tool to think about any grid improvements at any scale, from homes up to the bulk energy system. So Department of Energy recognizes that there are inequities in the way grid works today, from how investments are planned, how facilities are sited, who has the means and the expertise to influence decisions, who decides, who pays, who receives benefits, either in services or wealth building. So this is all need to be considered. And part of our process right now is to understand the landscape, how these trends fit together, how climate futures will create even more pressures on frontline communities. So in closing, I want to thank you for joining this roundtable. This roundtable gathered expertise and voices who can speak to these obstacles and help us rethink energy storage deployment. And I'm looking forward to our discussions. Thank you very much.
Professor Shundis is the founder and director of the Sustaining Urban Places Research. He brings a policy relevant approach to research, including the evaluation of environmental stressors on human health, developing of indicators and tools to improve decision making, and the construction of frameworks to guide the growth of urban regions. Over the past several years, research from his lab has appeared in the Smithsonian Magazine, National Public Radio, Washington Post, Minnesota Public Broadcasting, the New York Times, the Qatar Times, and several other national and international media. So welcome, Professor Shandas. Please begin your talk.
Hey, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Imra. And I will just note, Imra, you say my name like my mother would say it, so I really appreciate that. I'm really honored to be here to talk a little bit about a topic that I'm getting deeply interested and concerned about, and that is this idea of energy justice and the role that centering historically disinvested communities might play in being able to address this topic. I've intentionally titled this Metering Energy Justice, namely because of the topic that we're engaged with today, though also because it kind of provides, those three words provide an outline for my talk. Metering is, in my mind, a lot about measurement and measurement. Energy is, of course, the production of factors that drive the burning of fossil fuels, the collection of wind, the movement of waves, and being able to harness that. So many different forms of energy. And in a day where we're peaking with many records being shattered here in the Pacific Northwest, where I'm based, it seems only notable to bring up questions of justice, because a lot has happened in the past, as I'll mention today, in terms of why some communities are so disproportionately exposed to these incredibly hot summers and potentially cold winters, as well as floods and other major climate-induced events that we've been studying over a portion of time. I'll acknowledge not only some of the people here, Jackson, Chrissy, Alec, Yasuo, and Joey, who have contributed to this. This is a whole lab and a whole team effort. I'm right now a spokesperson for a lot of the work that's happening. So I really want to bring attention to those folks, as well as several organizations like the National Science Foundation, the Environmental Protection Agency, and U.S. Forest Service, who have all been part of our national funders for some of this work. So let me jump into this and just talk a little bit about what we mean in terms of why energy justice. And so what Imra, as well as the Secretary, has really teed up here is a future that is really different than what we're seeing in the past. And that is the frequency of not only of these extreme events that occur, but also a number of different acceleration of climate-induced impacts that we're seeing play out in our cities and regions. And I start with the idea of a lot of the post-mortem assessments, meaning the health implications of these extreme events, are getting increasingly precise in their recordings. And what we're seeing is that buildings and demographics really intersect to amplify vulnerability among communities. And where the buildings are placed, what people have access to in terms of resources, who they are, who their families and their intergenerational resources that are brought in, all those really play out in terms of the post-mortem excess mortality and morbidity that we're seeing from some of these, for example, heat waves. And then cities is where I spend a lot of time thinking about this. Cities amplify heat. They amplify a lot of climate-induced effects, including pluvial flooding, which we're also talking about in different circles. Though a lot of this is really unaccounted for. We have large-scale climate models that have been downscaled to let alone large grid cells. And so the specific units of analysis that we're looking at when we're thinking about risks are often very coarse, and that lends itself to really difficulties in being able to identify risks and where those risks may fall. Of course, as we're hearing from Imra, as well as others in the literature, we're hearing that our grid infrastructure is based on historical patterns of weather and climate that may not be what we're seeing coming up in the future. This record-breaking heat we're having currently in the Pacific Northwest, the heat dome, if you will, has really shed some light and really gotten a lot more concern over a week of days above 90 degrees that we're experiencing, which is, again, breaking more records and bringing some pause to our understanding of whether the grid that we have now will really be able to suffice. At last count, I saw about 370 PGE, Portland General Electric customers who were out of power right now. So we're seeing that coupled with power outages right now in real time. And then the buildings that we all inhabit and spend the majority of our times, our current development strategies are not, there aren't codes to be able to necessarily mitigate some of these climate-induced effects. Developers often get in and get out with certain types of development, certain forms of development that don't necessarily take into account the kinds of temperatures, the kinds of shifts that are happening on a global and then translated local level. And so what we're seeing is that private party decisions about what HVAC systems are being used, what specific technologies are being deployed are really idiosyncratic. And while some codes would move for safety and security in these buildings, we are seeing that those aren't necessarily always the norm in terms of managing these climate extremes. And so we're really rethinking the buildings, rethinking the technologies, and the role that regulations, policies, and programs play will be essential. And that's where the federal government, it's where the local land use planning agencies and building agencies will really factor into this discussion around energy justice. And so to get a little bit deeper into this, what we hear about heat is often this kind of very monolithic concept of center cities being much hotter than their surrounding hinterlands. And what that often translates to are these kind of profiles where the Environmental Protection Agency has this heat island profile on their site. You see NASA and other agencies putting forward maps of the continental United States showing where it's hotter, where it's colder, using satellites and land surface temperatures. And this is often the reference idea, the fact that urban areas are hotter than their surrounding hinterlands, and that's often using spatial weather stations that are stationary in nature, and then differences over the night are really often used. Also, common descriptions of urban heat islands are using land surface temperatures and looking at atmospheric brightness, emissivity, and finally, there's a third version of these urban heat measurements that are based on ground stations, though also bringing in other mobile stations of getting a more expansive description of what's happening in a region. And so what the aim of many of these kind of integrated satellite ground-based measurement approaches offer is a way to predict what might happen in a specific neighborhood over time. Yesterday, we were, my son and I were moving around town in well hydrated, and we were measuring some neighborhoods that were about 121 degrees Fahrenheit, which is unbelievable. And we're seeing that and in real time play out in our neighborhoods. And with that example, this is what we were seeing yesterday when we were driving around. This example of a building, we actually walked by this building. If you look at this facade, this is an area right near where we live. This particular facade, if you, I have a handy little infrared camera that I have in my back pocket most every time I go outside. And we're looking at this at about 157 degrees Fahrenheit was the temperature of this wall. Whereas just adjacent to this particular site was a wall that looked like this. And just coincidentally, we took a similar picture of this and we found that that was about 116 degrees. And so the built environment and, you know, thinking about 40 degrees difference here across this, across the landscape, and particularly at that micro scale of what we're thinking about, really brings up to mind what are the local ways to measure heat, what are ways to engage communities in this work, because ultimately with early and often engagement of communities, we can find appropriate technologies that would be suitable for specific households, businesses, and the like. And so part of what we're looking at here is this hyper-local urban heat island data, where we've been going around, and some of you may have seen some of this work show up in different news outlets, but just a quick summary is that we engage communities in affixing these very sensitive temperature humidity sensors on the vehicles, sometimes bicycles, sometimes walking, but most often cars. And we go around these pre-planned routes in cities and we collect near surface air temperature and humidity. And it allows for us to get at a very kind of human experience of what a community may be, what a person may be experiencing as they're walking in a particular part of town. And with those kind of real feel assessments, we can kind of think about how this can be done in multiple places simultaneously. We're currently working with the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, who's been a tremendous partner in this work to be able to scale this across the country. And we'll have finished by the end of this summer about 50 different cities across the country. There's a big gap in that Intermountain West area that we're looking to close in 2022. But we've gone out and been able to actually identify these particular places and their variation, intra-city variation of temperatures throughout the day. And so what we end up with are some maps that look like this for Detroit, for example, where we're getting high resolution spatial distribution of heat. We're able to overlay census data and look at social vulnerability in the conventional sense. We're able to evaluate the extent to which green assets in a city may actually cool neighborhoods, whereas those might not be cooled, which I'll come back to in a minute. And in many cases of a 90 or 95 degree day, we're seeing temperature differentials of about 11 degrees in this case, which is a bit lower, in part because when this community went out, it was only about 88 degrees, and the hotter it gets, the greater the amplification of temperatures across neighborhoods is a pattern we've been noticing. And for this discussion, we're really thinking about kind of the built environment and housing, or more generally building policy, where we're asking questions such as what structural types and design features correlate with higher or lower temperatures? And then to what extent can land use couple with cooling technology, such as battery storage in this case, to reduce vulnerability during rapid acceleration of warming and extreme climate-induced events like this heat wave. And so what's interesting about this is when we look at a city, for example, here, we've done this again in over 30 cities now. We'll have more than 50 after this year. But when we look at the town that I live in, Portland, Oregon, where we look at morning temperature distribution, this is near surface temperature distribution, and these are in Celsius. The morning looks considerably different than the afternoon, which looks similar to the evening. And we're seeing very granular descriptions of air temperature here. Down at the street level, we're actually able to pick up on these differences. And, and part of this could be what's happened in the past, why we're seeing these processes, because what we're seeing systematically across the cities that we've been studying is that often the hotter parts of a city are related to places where people have less formal education, limited English proficiency. There's a high level of racial diversity and extreme poverty in these hottest areas of this town. And similarly, when we're looking at who has access to central AC, we see that self-identifying white communities often have greater access to cooling resources, as well as Asian elderly, older adults having less access to heat refuges that the county, public health, and other organizations often offer, including the university I work for has opened up several different buildings today and yesterday and through the week for students to be able to use and staff to be able to use. So this correlation of vulnerability and heat has been now starting to play out across several cities. And I asked some of my colleagues, why am I seeing these particular patterns? And many of them for the last decade or so have been saying to me, well, it's because wealthier people have more access to resources. They can plant trees, they can change the albedo, they can really find ways to cool their immediate environment, which allows for them to actually pay less for energy to cool their homes and to be less vulnerable ultimately. Whereas lower resourced communities may not be able to do the same. And that was really unsatisfactory to me, in part because it really put the burden of evidence on the individual as opposed to the system, which is something I'm really interested in. So we started scratching our heads, and a couple of colleagues and I started digging into what may have led to these patterns of heat in a city. And so we dug into some set of maps that were just digitized in 2018 by the University of Richmond, Virginia. And these are historic redlining maps. If you're familiar with redlining, it was a federal policy back in the 1930s, right after Roosevelt was elected, and he could pass any policy he wanted in Congress, and it passed, unlike what we're seeing today. And what we saw that occur was this homeowners loan corporation emerge, which essentially worked with local municipalities, often consulting companies, to delineate neighborhoods into one of four grades, red being, or let me start with green being the quote best neighborhood, blue being still desirable, that was A and B. C, yellow, would be definitely declining in quotes, and D is hazardous in quotes. And so these were based largely on the color of people's skin living there, their income status, their immigrant status, and that allowed us to really think about what would be the distribution of these patterns in 108 cities across the region. So we looked at what had been done on redlining before, and we found that this great paper that came out of Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago was very instructive for us in getting into this research, where we were finding that historic redlining, homeowners loan corporation redlining maps were still persistent today, and that the neighborhoods that were redlined in 1933 were still seeing deep levels of economic inequality and segregation today. And we said, aha, this may be a really interesting pattern. Let's take a look at 108 cities across the country and see whether temperatures, meaning what somebody might experience in a neighborhood, in a household, on a city block, would be related to these historic patterns of redlining and a federal policy that was promulgated and ended in 1968, though do we still see the echo of that policy today? And what we found pretty systematically across the 108 cities was that temperatures in these A neighborhoods, quote, remember these are, quote, the best neighborhoods, and the D neighborhoods are the D, there was a consistent pattern across these neighborhoods in terms of surface temperature. And we looked a little more closely at these areas, and we were finding that the planning policies playing out were really about large amounts of asphalt and pavement were in these D and C neighborhoods. We were finding that highway projects were often driven right through the C and D neighborhoods, often severing historically connected neighborhoods. We're finding that large-scale housing projects, public housing projects, were often put in the C and D neighborhoods. And then industrial facilities were also sited in these locations. And we were finding that lack of parks and green space were all complicit with C and D neighborhoods as well. And when we looked a little more closely at what was actually on the landscape, we were finding that the D and C neighborhoods across the 108 cities were often had orders of magnitude greater amount of impervious surface. That's the pavement, the concrete, than tree canopy. And this was, again, using satellite imagery, relatively easy resource to be able to link to these different grades. Recent further analysis across any different part of the country, meaning if we look nationally, on the left bar over here is temperature and Holt grade. So that's land surface temperature. As you see, A, B, C, D, green being A, blue being B, C is yellow, and D is red. We see that temperatures consistently go up across, and that held out regardless of where we were looking across the country. This was true in the South, it was true in the Midwest, it was true in the Northeast, it was true in the West. And similarly with the tree canopy hypothesis, we were noticing that those things that could potentially cool a neighborhood at that, again, neighborhood scale would be often implicated in terms of having less amounts of that green space or tree canopy in those C and D neighborhoods, regardless of where you were in the country. So this got us really thinking about individual cities. So we spent some time looking at cities. What was the difference between A and D neighborhoods? And surprisingly for me, Portland, where I was just mentioning, ended up being a very, the biggest difference between the A and D neighborhoods of almost 13 degrees Fahrenheit that we were seeing. Denver, Minneapolis, being in the news recently a lot as well, were also high of the top 3 of our list. And this got us into thinking, you know, what does it mean to cool the city, and how do we think about this in terms of distribution of energy across the city? This is work one of my doctoral students, Chrissy Antonopoulos, and I and some others have been looking at building scale energy expenditure for the Portland metro region. That's what this map is. And what we're seeing is the levels of energy use really corroborate and really overlay fairly consistently with neighborhoods that have been historically marginalized or are lower income. And so that continues to be a pattern that we're seeing across the country, across the city, and we're really interested in seeing if this is actually going to play out in other parts of the country as well. As I come around the corner to kind of conclude what it is I think we could do about this, there's several angles to take this. I know that battery storage is one direction that this conversation is really going to get into, but let me just provoke you a little bit with a couple of modeling exercises that we've been doing, looking at how a change in an individual city block could actually vary temperatures considerably based on what's on the landscape. And if we can think about this as not one single silver bullet as battery storage, and think about this as battery storage coupled with a lot of other things that have to also happen locally at the tax lot level, at the street level, and at the neighborhood level, then we're really going to start getting into the myriad of solutions that are necessary for combating some of these rising temperatures. So we use this NVMet model to look at several neighborhoods. I'm just going to show you one based on time. I'm sweating profusely here with the heat in this office, my home office. Excuse me for 1 second as I wipe my forehead. And so part of what we're seeing with this NVMet modeling is that we took one neighborhood in Washington, D.C., for example, and this was working with the Department of Energy and Environment. They said, this neighborhood, we want to really find a way, public housing, what can you do in the surrounding landscape, and looking at Universal Thermal Comfort Index was our indicator. That's a combination of direct solar radiation, humidity, and temperature. And we were noticing that as we ran these models over this particular neighborhood and looking at different interventions, lightening colors, putting green roofs on, putting street trees, as well as green spaces surrounding that particular development, we were finding that afternoon temperatures, running these 3 scenarios from the base case, scenario 1, 2, and 3, we're finding that these strategies do help kind of blunt that peak heat that neighborhood was experiencing. And what that allowed us to do is not only put it across time, but also put it across space in that one development. So this was a really interesting approach to think about how to, from an outside and kind of building code perspective, what could some of the levers be for enabling these cooling applications? So as I come around and I use up my half hour here, and you indulge me with some of these, at least representation of some of our work, we also took that same NVMet model and ran a series of fluid dynamics models across the entire city as a whole. And we wanted to do 2 extreme examples. One where we're essentially creating a lot of cooling strategies like we had applied to that one public housing development, and the other just paving over asphalt across the whole city. And we had clustered the city into different development typologies and then ran these series of models to look at temperature difference. And we were noticing that these temperatures really vary from the left combination of cooling strategies. We can see that temperatures cool by about 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And then whereas when we pave it over, we're seeing amplification of temperatures. And so a lot of what we're experiencing in terms of heat is not only a result of these historic land use practices and policies that are in place, it's also about the incremental decisions that are being made around each of our neighborhoods, each of our cities, each of our tax lots adjacent to our environment. So part of what this is really trying to then see what are the places that one could potentially start thinking about applying potential strategies for cooling those neighborhoods that are disproportionately affected by heat. So if we're thinking about a neighborhood that is 120 degrees Fahrenheit as opposed to 90 degrees Fahrenheit or even 100 degrees Fahrenheit, could we take those historically disinvested, marginalized neighborhoods as places to center some of the technologies that you are talking about today, and some of the approaches, whether it be something related to rooftop reflectivity, whether it be related to particular configuration of development, whether it be related to backup storage for cooling systems that a community might procure. Those are strategies. And so we're really looking to evaluate the quality of the modeling outputs. We really are trying to align those with with field measurements. We're trying to get a sense for intervention scales, as well as trying to think about multi-sectoral applications. Increasingly, the Urban Land Institute is becoming a partner for collaborating to look at building sites that are undergoing development and trying to understand in situ cooling interventions that might work. And then, of course, there's been a long history of federal application of technologies, including redlining as a social technology on communities. So the trust there is something that I wouldn't want to leave this conversation without. The need for building trust locally when communities have been historically marginalized through particular policies is something that I have heard loud and clear as a researcher in this area, and trying to think about what might be strategies for building those trust and what role could community-based organizations play in that is really something that I want to leave this conversation emphasizing. So with that, I know my time is up here, and I will leave some contact information, and hope to continue engaging with this conversation in the coming weeks, months, and years. It sounds like there's a lot of really interesting proposals or solicitations that will be coming out from DOE in the coming months. So I'll keep ears open for that. Thank you.
Vivek, thank you, and appreciate. I also have my own tools as you do to stay camera ready and not melt on screen. So I appreciate you giving us that presentation. It's a marathon. A lot of the questions in the chat are going to what is the connection between storage and this problem set, which I think is that's really the goal of this event, everyone, is to try to collectively build the case about what are the strategies, what are the connections between this technology, what could it possibly do to advance some of the issues that Vivek laid out for us so well. This is why we wanted to start with his presentation to describe what we think the concerns really are in detail from a research scale effort. So I really appreciate all the comments in the chat about that. And we also saw a lot of questions about the unique aspects of an urban condition, Vivek, as opposed to a suburban condition. And I believe David pointed out, for example, that Portland is well known for high pressure against sprawl. And how does that sync up with some of your questions about temperature? So maybe I could ask that one question before we move to the next panel, which is, how do you relay what you're learning in cities based on overall land use design or suburban communities or for other communities?
I think I get the question. Is it kind of a summative question about like how can we convey what we're learning? Is that?
It's more about the landscape itself being a really densely lived in community. And so how well do some of these lessons translate to smaller communities or suburban communities?
Oh, sure. No, I mean, these are often I've gone where the data sets are, and we have, cities are incredibly rich repositories of data. And so we've gone there, but I don't think this necessarily precludes the application of policies that have also played out in rural or suburban areas where we find that there are also patterns of segregation that have played out, whether it be through gated communities or whether it be through particular privatized areas. We're seeing that there is a great deal of kind of disparity that plays out regardless of whether you're looking specifically at a city or places surrounding a city. There are several examples, not only in the US, but internationally, that come to mind. Let me pause there. I don't want to take up too much time given your schedule.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Vivek, it was Dr. Shandas, it was great to have you with us. Thank you for doing this under such duress, environmental duress of your own. I appreciate it. And for everyone's benefit, we will be posting all of the slides on the event webpage so that you can reference them later, including his contact information. So thank you again for your time.
Let me add my thanks.
Yes,
and I would like to remind all of us that this entire roundtable is an exploratory roundtable. This is a beginning. At the Department of Energy, we have not talked very much about social equity, except when it comes to weatherization or similar issues. we want to see what we can contribute from the point of view of the Office of Electricity and Energy Storage in particular to ameliorate the situation. And we will explore using all means at our disposal of how to go about this. And so you're welcome to put in your contributions. We are always looking for new ways and new ideas.
Yes,
Thank you.
very well said. So thank you everyone for the chats that we're seeing. David asked a really good question. David from New York asked a question about how do you define these communities, and that there are different ways that each community might recognize itself in its definition. So that is one of the questions we'll be exploring in this next panel among our state representatives. We also wanted to acknowledge Judith, you asked a question about Oakland, the example that Imre brought up in his previous talk. I wanted to make sure folks were aware that on the website for the event, we have several memos that describe things like what is the state of practice around metrics right now for equity, what provided some case studies associated with storage as a solution for peaker or other kind of fossil fuel decommissioning processes, or otherwise optimizing them so that they are less polluting to local neighborhoods. We have one that's related to the community energy storage business models. How can those actually be developed in a way to support more wealth building locally? And then we have kind of a global journal article that describes what we think might be the connections between storage and social equity. So I want to invite all of you to take a look at those materials and offer us your feedback on them, but that those might be helpful for you as you're thinking about this issue with us. Imre, any more comments from you before we move on to the state panel?
No, carry it on. You're in charge.
All right. Thank you. Savannah, do you mind putting up the landing slide for us? And then I'll invite our panelists. I think Sarah, are you with us? And also Joy?
Yes, this is Joy. I'm here.
Great. Welcome, everyone. So at this point, we're going to move in the webinar on to two other panels. The first one is focused on states. For us, this has been a place where we see a lot of the vanguard action around trying to connect these activities around social equity. You know, the governance requirements of a state might include more of these other dimensions around health and well-being, as well as energy. So we see a lot of activity happening within our state energy offices and our state utility regulatory commissions. So we've invited a few of them that are particularly active here to participate with us. Sarah Vorpal is with the Washington Department of Commerce, and Joy Wang is with the Michigan Public Service Commission. Crystal Pruitt with the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities is going to join us shortly. She had to go to Newark and give a talk quickly, but she is texting me that she is racing here as soon as she can. So in the meantime, what we'll do for this panel, if everyone will stay with me, is we'll move for Sarah and for Joy to offer some thoughts about their organizations and what they're working on as states in the connections more globally between what are the energy systems, what's going on with the energy system, and what kinds of investments might have meaning for people in the social equity space. After we do that, then and Krista will hopefully be here by then, and then we'll move into some Q&A. So if folks have chat questions that they want to offer, I'll be monitoring that and doing my best to cover that before we top out at the hour, and we'll move on to some dialogue directly with representatives of communities around the country. Please do look at that agenda. It's really exciting. I'm really interested to hear everyone's remarks. So could we start with, I think, Sarah, you're up first. Do you mind? Thank you.
Honor's mine. Thank you. Great. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to get to speak here today. It's really an honor to be here. My name is Sarah Vorpal. I work at the Washington State Department of Commerce, State Energy Office, and I'm going to speak today about how our agency is really thinking about the issue of energy equity, which is, I'm so excited that this workshop is existing to dig down a little deeper into this very important topic. So just to start, I'm at the Department of Commerce, which might seem weird for some folks if you know that I'm also at a state energy office. You know, how does that work? So I think it's a really helpful conversation to have when we think about what's necessary to be successful in energy equity as state agencies. So this slide represents, you know, kind of the broader missions of the Department of Commerce. So you can see energy up in the right-hand corner. We have the broad mission of strengthening communities. So we have, you know, a housing services and community services division. We have an Office of Economic Development. We have a local government division that works on planning. We work on housing and homelessness, infrastructure, community facilities, and, you know, helping state agencies walk the talk on our climate goals. So the point here is that we have huge coverage as an agency, as do many agencies, in terms of the policy topics we cover. And, you know, in the past couple of years, our state has passed, and especially this last year, just really banner huge climate energy policy. And so that's starting to kind of trickle out, and, you know, all the administrative work is happening. So, you know, in the past couple of years, our agency has started really focusing on the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which has been mainly focused in the Energy Department. And that focuses on the clean energy standard, but also a huge amount of equity considerations and how we actually operationalize equity. And we also administer the Clean Energy Fund, which I think there's probably some recipients of that fund on this call. I saw some names as I was looking through the participants list, but that supports things like grid modernization. We've done a lot of work with the Pacific Northwest National Lab through some of those grants and projects to think about how to right size storage, how to place it on the grid in the right way, how to value the benefits. So there's been all this really cool technical work that has happened. And it's sort of been focused up here in the corner on infrastructure and energy, energy and a little bit on infrastructure. And now we really need to widen the lens and start to think about how all these other pieces of what our agency does and what is important to communities intersects with energy policy. You know, how do we think about affordable housing? How do we think about connecting with communities and understanding their future planning? And how does that relate to siting and agriculture and other kinds of economic development opportunities? So if we go to the next slide. Great, thank you. So the other thing about all of those different divisions is that we're all very siloed. We're a huge bureaucracy, right? We're actually quite a small agency, 200 folks overall, but we pass through around $3 billion in funding. And so, you know, we really have all kinds of things we do, but we've done it in such a siloed way. And so much of that comes out of issues like that I'll talk through later, right, in terms of funding streams and other work. So really the work of the agency that we need to do to be effective in equity is internal. And there's so much internal work that we need to get done to change and evolve the way we administer programs. And so that has actually started to be recognized by our state legislature, which was kind enough to provide quite a bit of funding to commerce this past session, specifically focused on equity. And so I just wanted to kind of use this as a way to talk about the type of work that we're envisioning needs to get done quite quickly here. So with more discussion to follow. So the big piece that's important for us right now is what's called the HEAL Act, the Health Equity for All Act. Commerce got about $1.5 million to administer this, this new law. And what it does is it requires that 7 named state agencies, as well as other agencies that want to opt in, incorporate environmental justice into their strategic plan. And that includes coming up with robust community engagement and outreach, trying to think about how we improve technical assistance, providing space for not only funding capital projects through competitive grant programs, but supporting pre-design and pre-development work and feasibility studies to support access to these grants for all communities, that especially those that haven't gotten to take advantage before, you know, and understanding what we actually need to get built in the state to support energy equity. It includes internal change management. We can't do the work externally if we're not doing the work internally, building capacity around racial equity and other DEIR topics, but also really focusing on environmental justice and what that means and how it plays in our state. And then also really doing all of that towards lasting system change. So large scale cultural change. And I think, and I apologize, I don't have a timer in front of me, but Rebecca, if you could give me a little signal that maybe move on to Joy.
That sounds great. Let's move ahead. Thank you so much, Sarah, for those opening comments.
Yeah.
Joy, you're up.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joy Wong. I'm an engineer at the Michigan Public Service Commission. And today I'll be speaking about the current efforts and next steps regarding energy equity at the Commission. Next slide. But before I begin, I do have a disclaimer that all the views that are expressed are solely my own and do not express the views of the Michigan Public Service Commission. The Commission speaks through its orders. Next slide, please. So the Michigan Public Service Commission, its mission is to ensure safe, reliable, accessible energy and telecommunication services at reasonable rates to Michigan residents and businesses. It has a regulatory role. It does not have a policy role, so that does constrain what the Commission can do. But there are several different areas within the Commission where energy equity issues are either addressed or have energy equity implications. And the first one is, of course, the Commission's strategic plan. This was updated this year to include equity and inclusion best practices. And the Commission also has internal diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives where staff is learning more about these issues. And in the process of learning more, they are also exploring areas of the Commission's work where equity can be elevated. Utility rate cases are an area that the Commission focuses on frequently as the utilities come in to seek approval for their proposed costs and spending. And as equity-based programs and pilots come through, those are also reviewed in those processes. Integrated resource plans provide a future-looking plan that the utilities have for how their energy will be supplied, what resources will be used. And the Commission coordinates with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, which we also call EGLE, to consider environmental justice, health impacts, and greenhouse gas emissions in those plans. There are a number of work groups at the Commission, which also have an energy equity lens. The first one is the Energy Waste Reduction Low Income Work Group, which was established in 2018 to help identify and address low income specific energy issues. And recently the Commission initiated the Energy Affordability and Accessibility Collaborative. And in that collaborative, issues such as energy affordability, access to low income energy assistance, and customer protections are explored. Next slide, please. Commission also participates in other state of Michigan initiatives. And the first one is the Interagency Environmental Justice Response Team, which is focused on integrating equity and environmental justice into state government. And the team is assisting EGLE in developing Michigan's first environmental justice screening tool. And this will help allow future programs and analyses to better incorporate those environmental justice metrics. The Energy Transition Impact Project is focused on providing assistance to help develop energy transition strategies for areas that are going to be affected in this transition to a cleaner energy future, such as our communities that will be experiencing coal power plant closures. And the Council on Climate Solutions and the Michigan Council on Future Mobility and Electrification both also have energy equity considerations. The My Power Grid initiative is a multi-year stakeholder initiative that's supported by Governor Whitmer and the Michigan Public Service Commission to help maximize the benefits of the transition to clean distributed energy resources for the state. It has 3 different areas of emphasis. The first one is grid optimization. Second one is customer engagement. And the third area is integrating emerging technologies. And within My Power Grid, there are several work groups that actually have learnings pertaining to energy equity or energy equity implications. And the first work group is energy programs and technology pilots, which is in that customer engagement bucket. And in this work group, we actually learned about the lack of social economic data that's currently being collected by many of our utility pilots. And with no data on those metrics, it's really impossible to analyze how those pilots impact equity considerations. And in the same time, we also learned about the strong interest from our stakeholders and our communities in future energy pilots addressing community needs in a really holistic and equitable fashion. The Customer Education and Participation Work Group focuses on how to better outreach, educate, and involve all customers. It's an ongoing effort. And another work group with equity implications is the New Technologies and Business Models work group, which is currently ongoing. We're kind of in the report writing phase for this work group right now. And in this work group, we heard about the community and stakeholder interest in a variety of energy technologies, including energy storage and microgrids. And we also learned about the barriers that they're facing that prevent them from implementing those projects that they're so interested in, and some potential solutions that might help resolve those hurdles. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps at the Commission, I believe that this emphasis on equity and energy equity issues will continue, not only because of the interest from the Commission, but also from stakeholders that we've engaged in. You know, we have a lot of efforts focused on meaningful stakeholder engagement right now to better understand the needs of our communities and our stakeholders. And as we understand their needs and their goals more, I'm hoping that our utility pilots and programs will be improved to help address some of those needs, and that our regulatory framework will also be evolved to help address some of those regulatory barriers that we're learning about, as well as to meet some of those business model needs. And it's my personal hope that we'll collect better data on all of these programs, conduct better analyses, and then hopefully use those to inform our next steps as we engage in future iterations of stakeholder engagement and continued cycles of improvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. That was excellent. And there's a lot that you said just then that really helped me fine-tune some of my questions for all of you in the panel. Crystal, I think you're with us. Are you there?
I am there. I am here.
Wonderful. Do you want to give a shot and walk through your material related to the New Jersey effort?
Sure. Let me put you on video. Or put myself on video. I don't know. Can you see me?
We will in a moment. I believe Sarah's just going to highlight you. Yes. Yes, we can see you.
Okay. Well, first,
Hi there.
hello and apologies. I am actually in Newark, New Jersey at an event highlighting the integration of affordable housing and energy efficiency. So really relevant to my work. So, which is why I had to split my time. But so hello, everyone. My name is Crystal Pruitt. I am the Deputy Director in the Division of Clean Energy in the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. I am also in charge of the newly created Office of Clean Energy Equity here at the board. So this office was created in the summer of 2020, and I came on board November of 2020 to start it. So it's still very much in its early stages. But the goals of this office that I am tasked and privileged to run is to ensure access for residents, including New Jersey's low and moderate income and overburdened communities. So overburdened communities is a legal term here in New Jersey as a result of our environmental justice law, and that defines census tracts and communities where there is a significant percentage of minority residents, a significant percentage of English being a second language, as well as economic component, so what we would consider low income. So census tract only needs to have one of those three to be considered overburdened. So the goal is to make sure that all of the benefits of clean energy are accessible and all residents are able to partake. It's also my goal internally within the board, specifically in the division, to ensure that all of our programming, including marketing, takes equity into consideration. So we make sure that we are marketing and communicating in ways that centers low and moderate income and overburdened communities, and lifts them up. I also am in charge of a lot of stakeholder engagement. Specifically, we are undertaking an energy efficiency transition as a result of the Clean Energy Act signed in 2018 by Governor Murphy, which transferred clean energy programming, or excuse me, not clean energy programming, but energy efficiency program from the state back to the utilities So we are undergoing that transition right now, but to ensure that all voices are heard and at the table, we are having stakeholder engagement, including equity working groups, which handles things like participation and supplier diversity, and workforce development working group, which highlights workforce pathways for energy efficiency work. So it's been really critical that we're engaging stakeholders, everyone from AARP, all the way to our environmental non-government organizations, all the way to grassroots organizations, including some of those that are actually with me at this event in Newark. And we also focus equity programming. So we have something called the Comfort Partners Program, and that is a program for our low income residents here in the state, so they can get energy efficiency improvements to their households to at no cost to them. And it's something that we have co-managed with the utilities that has been very successful. So I guess next slide. So when the board is addressing equity, when it comes to energy, there are challenges as well as opportunities. So one of the things we've been really exploring lately is how do we measure equity? I feel that in times we think about equity either purely mathematic terms or purely kind of qualitative social justice terms. And what we've been working on is kind of integrating the two. So when we talk about things like participation in programs, well, how do we measure that beyond, ticking boxes and collecting information? What story does it tell? So from what we've been doing, we have been working on how we can define equity in our state and what we want to achieve, and how we define equity in terms of tangible programmatic goals. And also, while we're capturing the data, we're not forgetting to tell the larger story and the larger narrative within that. So we're also working on building equity. So for me, it's been a real goal to help folks understand what equity means when we're talking about energy, and that it's not accidental that some communities have been left behind. So due to decades and centuries of governmental decisions, all the way from the federal government, all the way to the lower levels of municipal government, there have been decisions that have been made to disenfranchise and otherwise marginalize communities. So as a government entity, we have a responsibility to intentionally rectify all of the wrongs that have been perpetrated on these communities. So to do that, we have to be purposeful and intentional, but we also need to listen to the community and their needs. And we need to take that information back and make sure that we're integrating it in how we think about programs moving forward, in addition to the programs that we have now within the board. We are also, as I mentioned in the last slide, focusing on workforce development. So we have a specific focus on EE workforce development, but we're also looking at larger clean energy workforce development that will incorporate things like wind as well as solar. So when we're looking at workforce development, we're not just looking at any jobs, we're looking at all the jobs and understanding that we should, with all the work that we're doing in low income communities, we are looking at how do we create generational wealth? So how do we prepare someone, not just with a job, but a career pathway that they can carry that with them generation to generation. So that's something that we're focusing on really intently. And we have a lot of community level stakeholders, some of which who do job training, like the Urban League and Green Faith in our state, and some that are just kind of individual community resources like our New Jersey Environmental Justice Coalition. And we're also exploring things like community energy resilience. So, exploring the role of microgrids in low-income communities and reliability and resilience for these communities, especially in large weather events. So these are all things that we're exploring, and we're trying to get really creative and also humbling ourselves because we can't take anything off the table because the outcome and the importance of this work. So I know there was questions in the chat. I am doing this at an event, so I apologize if I wasn't able to kind of touch on them as they were coming in. But again, my name is Crystal Pruitt, And I am going to stick around for as long as I can and talk more about the work that we're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Crystal. And no worries, I've got you on the chat. We'll make sure we get some of those questions taken care of. If you can hang with us as long as you can, we'd love it. I appreciate that you're multitasking in this way. So everyone, we had already kind of prepared some Q&A for you guys, and we talked about it, but I really want to talk about a couple things that you guys brought up and how you're handling it. So one of them, and Sarah, your first slide did this, it was like, hey, people don't just experience energy and then they experience transportation and then they experience health. These things are all connected. How do you handle this multidisciplinary idea? How do you work with other agencies, or how do you kind of try to do that all in one as part of your job?
Man, if I knew the answer to that. No, I mean, it's really, to be completely honest, I think it's about giving the necessary timelines to do equity work well and recognizing where bureaucratic barriers have existed and being able to be really honest about that. I think that can be one of the biggest difficulties in terms of this, this work that really looks to kind of, in a lot of the ways, thank you, Crystal, so much. I wish you would have gone first. You really articulated so many of the things that I think our agency is thinking about as well. But all these huge groundbreaking things that we're trying to get done, and really how long it takes to have new kinds of conversations. So, I think the legislature tends to be ahead, and communities and organizers are ahead of the legislature, who are informed by all this incredible work in terms of transformative energy equity work. And so how you actually line up policy with the programs that we use to serve, especially when the jurisdiction for those is not always clear. So I think a great example of this is transportation equity. I saw that in the chat, and like electrification transportation systems, right? And electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure as an electricity issue versus a transportation issue. But our partners at the Washington State Department of Transportation, Ecology, local planners, I mean, they're all part of that conversation. And my colleague, Michael Breach, is actually, I would say a big portion of his job is doing this stakeholdering internally to state agency family, and making sure we're able then to line up and be a resource to the communities that are trying to do this work. So the answer is recognizing barriers and providing the necessary timelines to overcome incredible institutional change.
Yeah.
Just to start.
Yeah. Operating in a bureaucracy and taking the time to do it right. I appreciate those themes. Crystal or Joy, any other comments on how to handle this multi-layered challenge?
Yeah, I think the commission's role being a regulatory role, it kind of constrains the types of actions that we can take. And in the stakeholder processes that we have the privilege of engaging with a lot of really very passionate stakeholders. We have small neighborhoods and villages to very large cities who are really very passionate about these energy technologies and want to find sustainable solutions for their community. And we also have utilities at the table, and nonprofits and business organizations. So I feel that the commission has definitely a role to play in finding solutions, but we need everyone at the table to contribute their knowledge and their abilities to help solve the problem.
Yeah.
And Rebecca, before I have to run off, because I actually have to speak in like a second, I did want to answer that question.
Yeah.
So an approach that we've taken is very similar to the approaches just mentioned, is that, when we have these engagements, we have everyone at the table. So we have, grassroots, non-governmental. I also have members of our labor department, our economic development authority. I have our human services. So I include literally every department that will answer my phone calls and my emails, and I get them involved and I engage them to figure out how this works, because it's recognizing that, like with most, I think, social justice, because I include energy and social justice, it's systemic. So the changes and the things that we improve have to be done together. So I guess that would be my 2 cents, is that I get everyone at the table. Obviously you have to steer them, right? Because you can't get everyone to the table and not have a plan, but make sure they understand their role and how they fit into the piece of the puzzle, and build the conversation on that. And, we also have the utilities. So we have everyone, and just pushing everyone to think outside the box, because something that I always say is that the status quo perpetuates inequality, because if the status quo worked, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be in this office. So whatever we're doing, we have to challenge ourselves to do it differently and do it better than we had before. But I have to run, but I will be back.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll save a question. I have a question I want to ask all of you, but I'll wait for Crystal to get back. Joy, you said something I thought was really interesting in your comments. You said, I think this is something we're starting, but I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And I think for a lot of people, it's like, has this been everywhere and we just never paid attention to it in the forums in which we work here in energy? And maybe you could just talk about why is this issue now and what is happening to kind of put it in its place in time, you know? It's not like this just magically became a social issue all of a sudden, right? So, or maybe it did, I don't know. Please offer your thoughts on the timing element and the durability of the issue.
Yeah, I think, you know, some of our previous presenters, they talked about the longstanding historical issues that kind of caused, you know, the problems that we see today that we're trying to address through energy equity. And at least at the state of Michigan, through the commission's work, I feel like we really have started diving deeper into these stakeholder engagements and work groups through the My Power Grid initiative. You know, we have had past issues where we look, or work groups where we looked at energy equity issues, but through the My Power Grid initiative, you know, we've really engaged with a variety of stakeholders in our communities to understand their needs and their own goals. And in like the energy programs and technology pilots work group, when we were discussing the types of energy pilots our stakeholders would like to see, you know, we learned from communities that despite, you know, the best well-meaning, you know, planners and program developers at the utilities in the past, some of them have felt that maybe they weren't included at the table when they were designing those programs. So the effectiveness of the end product wasn't exactly what maybe the utility had wanted, because engagement from the local community wasn't as high, and the community maybe felt that their needs weren't necessarily heard. And so through these engagements, you know, we're learning how to better go about doing this, right? Like, let's include those communities that we want to assist, include them at the table when we're developing and designing these programs to make sure that the end product is actually something that they are excited about, that they'll want to participate in, where the utility can have learnings, and then we can all move forward and create better solutions that help address not only the community's needs for sustainability and all of these other great equity concerns, but also ensure that the utility system is still safe and reliable. So I think this is work that we're starting and we're doing more of, and I hope it'll continue, especially as we start learning more about the data that we need and have additional metrics where we can measure our progress and design future next steps in a more meaningful way.
Thank you for that, Joy. Sarah, did you have any comments?
I would just quickly add that I actually think a lot of the work that we're kind of moving towards in terms of energy equity comes out of, especially in Washington, we have a lot of public power, and sort of the history of public power is really about electricity, you know, as a public good, and being able to create a business case, you know, be able to create infrastructure regardless of business case, right? So the history of focusing on reliability and affordability, I think anyone in public power on this call is going to be nodding their heads that, yeah, they know how to do that, right? Like, that is the mission. It's why y'all exist. I think we are just having, you know, kind of a reconciliation around what access and accessibility, access and equity mean in terms of the who. And that has to do a lot with just re-understanding, you know, the kind of the racial equity issues that have long been part of racial, you know, kind of health equity disparities, and how health disparities are kind of contributed to by energy and in the energy sector. And so that's that interface between so much of what both Crystal and Joy have talked about, right? Affordable housing and the different projects around community resilience. So I actually think this is a long-standing mission in a lot of ways of power, of public power, I can say, right? And especially of those that are looking to increase reliability and accessibility. We just need to, again, reconstruct the lens and scope, and then also kind of reconcile that with the need to reconcile the disparities and past harms that the government agencies that kind of deploy these policies have caused.
Yeah, I have to agree with Sarah that, you know, we're very good at looking at like reliability and affordability in the energy and like regulatory space. But the one issue that we are, struggling with is the lack of metrics and quantification of those non-energy benefits, right? When we're talking about equity, and sustainability and resiliency, there's really not a good quantification of those so that they can be included in the regulatory process, and those benefits can be accounted for when we make future energy investments in new infrastructure, for instance. And so that's an area that I feel like we're starting to learn more about. I know the labs are doing great research and they're starting to explore that. And we definitely appreciate all of the times that you guys have come out to educate us at our stakeholder events, because everyone respects you guys as a neutral third party, and it really adds a lot. And the fact that you guys are exploring some of these issues and sharing your findings with us definitely helps elevate our conversations. And I think it's an area where we're learning more as I think all together, and hopefully as we learn more on how to quantify those non-energy benefits, they can be included in these regulatory proceedings more too.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. Yeah, like it's a big challenge, right? To think about reliability and cost, which we have we've built a very well-established practice for in the regulatory environment, and suddenly adding in new dimensions and new objectives for the grid. It's going to take some time to build that in a way that makes sense. But also, Sarah just said something that was, I think, important to highlight, that there are public power. There's a lot of different types of utilities. And there are some that come to you, Joy, and there are some that Sarah's going to be more familiar with because her role is not in the regulatory function, right? So it's really valuable to think about utilities differently too. I know we're going to explore some of that at our panel tomorrow. That's about, kind of what are the best practices happening in utilities. We're going to be featuring Seattle City Light, for example, that Sarah knows very well, because a municipality has a lot more visibility into other aspects of their community. So that's also a great point, that utilities are in different postures. I really want to make sure I ask this question, and Dick Henry in the chat said, what about that? The scaling problem, right? So you guys are a different space than we are at the federal level. So we're trying to share practices among states, but at the community level, how do you see all of these different scales of efforts kind of stacking up? How do you think about really being able to deploy something that's really community scale this widely? Can you offer your thoughts on scale? Sure, Sarah, please go first.
Well, I think it really comes down to the role of what the state is there for. And for me, that's, again, the thing I said about aligning programs with the policy that we are, that we have in the state. So in Washington, Governor Inslee has really led around a lot of huge green efforts, including the clean energy standard. We just passed a cap and trade bill, as well as a low carbon fuel standard. So we've got all kinds of policies coming our way, and it's going to be really exciting to see how they all play out. I think where the rubber meets the road is really understanding how to get access to and value community data and expertise as we really understand what communities need, and really taking a human-centered approach to questions of community, of resilience, including how we use storage technology to support communities. And today in the Pacific Northwest of all days is a great day to be thinking about that, as we have a massive heat wave that will look just like a normal day, maybe in 10 years from now. So, how do we understand what communities need? And, so much of that comes from pilots. And so you definitely get, these pilots that provide data, and a lot of the work actually Washington State has done has been with PNNL in terms of, how to right size, because there's no manual that says, here's how and where you put storage and what size it should be, right? How do utilities even know how to do that? So a lot of the work in the state has been just incredible work from PNNL with our state utilities trying to figure that question out. Now the real question is, how do you work with a local planner that is looking at its 50-year infrastructure and can incorporate that storage? And I think that really comes down to, what has been said about 50 times already, but robust tools and metrics to support that conversation, but also, the technical assistance and timelines necessary to really center the community needs and planning efforts. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about what we're hearing from communities, but and I really see the state as a well-positioned to kind of siphon up all those stories and aggregate out those learnings and then push them up to the federal level in terms of, what do we need around technical assistance? What do we need really specifically around data and tools? Because there is kind of somewhere between a tool that maps everything and a tool that maps only one thing, and we probably need something in between. So, it's not a satisfying answer because it's like everything all at once. And, you know, you have to extrapolate a lot of stories into these kind of mid-level, these mesoscale learnings. But again, I'm going to keep saying this, but it's timelines, providing us the space and time and robust community engagement to actually get those stories in a non-extractive way, but that really centers the community experience and need, and then be able to translate that into that kind of holistic community resilient story and projects that is going to look very different for each community.
I agree with you, Sarah. I think every community kind of requires its own solution. Like when you're talking about incorporating distributed energy resources like storage, every community has its own localized solution that might be best fit for their grid. And I think in terms of determining what that solution is, or what technologies you can use in concert to best achieve the goals of the community, that has to be determined based on, you know, data and knowledge and understanding of the limitations or issues that they can solve through those new energy technologies in that particular location. And that can also inform, you know, the benefits and the costs for that total system. So part of the necessary, I guess, input to determine some of those localized solutions is to first have that information available. And that's something that we've heard a lot from our stakeholders. You know, they're interested in getting more data about the grid so that they can determine where to best site some of these energy projects.
Right, there's a lot to figure out, not just what the issues are, right, but what the right kinds of solutions might even be. Can you talk about that though for a moment? And I know we wanted to ask, like, what are you hearing from communities, but also this question of like, are communities able to even answer these questions, or is there still capacity? Is there still more work to be done in enabling capacity in communities to engage effectively? I know, Sarah, once we first started talking about this, we were talking about data is actually important because it's an empowerment tool. Mm-hmm. Other people can see data and have different conclusions from it. So making publicly available tools is really valuable for other people to draw their own conclusions and be able to work with it themselves. Can you offer any thoughts about that capacity building and community engagement and strategies for doing that well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to just put some explicit details around what data actually we're talking about, right? So at the agency, we're working on what's called the Washington Energy Infrastructure Assessment Tool. So really trying to layer on multiple types of, you know, emergency management, fuel planning, community demographics, outage data, all of these things into a tool that really helps us understand where there are areas from a grid perspective that need to have resilience incorporated into the grid to support, you know, reliability and access. And that's really, again, a technology specific look that really, I mean, that's something utilities do all the time when they do long-term planning, but I think having a more of a statewide understanding of that through things like hosting capacity analysis or outage maps, like linked onto vulnerable populations and other climate data, like, you know, there's just, I can go into a lot of specifics for Washington, which I won't do today. We're just getting those going. And we really need, I think, support on that. And then I think in terms of a state level, because we also are capacity constrained. So we have the ability to, you know, implement a program and bring people together, be conveners. We can be holders of resources, but sometimes it can be very hard to be the researchers, you know, that even though my background does happen to be as a scientific researcher, I think that it, you know, and there's a lot of very smart folks that can do this work. It is just, you know, we are actually a relatively small agency, I think, for the amount of work sometimes that's on our plate. And then that just trickles down to the communities, right? So then you have someone in, you know, a local planning office in a local jurisdiction, and they're wearing about 10 times more hats than I am. So one, meeting people where they're at. And the things I hear a lot are, in terms of need, please be very clear about what the opportunity is so that I can understand if it's worth going after. So I think it really behooves, you know, the DOE and state agencies as we're creating competitive grants. I think we've said a lot about co-creation and, you know, incorporating kind of an equitable process into creating those grants, but also just like, what is this? What does it do? How do I create a champion in my community for this? How do, you know, what support do I have? So being really clear about what this thing funds, what it does, and how it actually works. Because some people look at that and are like, oh, we don't have the capacity to support that. I'm not going to even go after it. Or, you know, they don't even have the time to look into it, or even know if it's worth going after, or they spend a lot of time on something. I mean, I've heard reports about spending a long time creating an application for a grant program, and then it turns out there's some policy barrier that makes it actually really hard to access. And so, right, it can just be very frustrating, I think, to have that experience. So I think, clarity on what the opportunity is, and then again, those pre-design and pre-development work is so big, and that's a lot of what internally we're trying to get better at. Because we actually ran a process where we did an assessment of our grants to say, what do we need to do better, you guys? Like, how can we make these more accessible? And these are these competitive clean energy fund grants. And we heard over and over again, pre-design, pre-development work, technical support on how to even do the grant, technical support on how to come up with an idea, feasibility studies. These are the kinds of things that, if you're a local planner, again, you're looking at upgrading your wastewater, you're looking at upgrading your broadband, like, it is so hard to get that stuff done for small communities anyway. It's very hard to be like, hey, you know what, you should add on something really shiny and fancy too around the energy space, right? But if you're creating 50-year infrastructure, man, you want to get that stuff in there. So let's, be able to support a local champion through better timelines and through more kind of opportunities to understand what the opportunities are.
That was great, Sarah. Joy, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I agree with you, Sarah, about being resource constrained, not only in state government, like at the commission, but also for a lot of the communities that we've engaged in, especially for the smaller communities. Like you said, many of those people who are working with energy issues are wearing multiple hats. And that's one thing that we have heard a lot. So in our new technologies and business models work group, we explored 6 different technologies and talked about their barriers and possible solutions that are preventing communities from actually implementing these technologies and realizing the benefits they might afford. And what we heard is, education outreach, almost consistently for all of them. There's so many cases where we even had communities who had implemented some of these technologies who came out and spoke with us, where they might have not initially even considered these technologies because they didn't really know about it. But it wasn't until, a representative from the utility reached out, or someone from, a DOE funded technical assistance center actually reached out and shared what the technology could do and the benefits it could provide, where the community or the organization realized that, hey, this is a great solution to this problem that we want to solve. And there's all these other benefits. So I think the education component and outreaching to communities and to people who might be implementing these technologies, getting that information out there is key, so that they know that this is a possible solution and that they know what that solution might afford them in terms of benefits in their location. And that's an area that we also found, is that even for technologies that seem really promising and where other areas similar to Michigan have used them to really great effect, like heat pumps, for instance, we don't have Michigan specific studies, and so for some of those Michigan stakeholders, they would really love to know, what does this really mean for Michigan? It's great that Maine did a great job with this, but what does it mean in Michigan? And so having those types of studies and information available, I think will really help further people's confidence in implementing some of these solutions.
That's a great point. The people can appreciate the information globally, but they really do need to see it as it fits, how well it really fits their circumstances and their conditions. I have another question, and it's kind of related to something that was also posted in the chat, which is this idea of like, how do you know which communities you're trying to work with, right? And Crystal uses the term overburdened because that was handed to her legislatively, and that's available to her. Environmental justice is another term that's pretty well established in terms of, at least there's legal definitions for it. Can you talk about how Michigan and Washington, and maybe Crystal, when she rejoins us, can take this for New Jersey, how you guys have thought about which communities fit this definition and what it means to prioritize those communities, as opposed to how we might normally go about business, which is more like available to whomever wants it, right? Like the extra work may be involved also. All right. Joy, can you go first this time, and then we'll go back to Sarah?
I think, at the commission, we are kind of just reaching out to stakeholders right now and trying to understand their needs. And some of that engagement is very broad. Our meetings are publicly available. Anyone who wants to join can join us. But we do have certain people who are very passionate, who are consistent stakeholders who join our meetings. And then there are others who are constrained. One of the things that we discussed in the Energy Programs and Technology Pilots work group is that sometimes you can invite these like low-income communities or communities of colors to join your event and to participate in the stakeholder process, but they might face barriers to actually participating, right? Maybe they don't have childcare or transportation or an internet connection that allows them to join the meetings in an effective format. And so that's something that we are also exploring to talk about. Are there ways that we can address some of those barriers moving forward so that when we do start talking about developing better utility programs or utility pilots, how can we get those people at the table so they're included in the process early on and can actually inform the development of programs that really impact them and benefit them to the largest extent possible. So I think that's an area that we're working on. I don't know if we necessarily have a mandate legislatively or like a definition of the populations that we have to reach out to right now. Like I said earlier, I think this is an area that we're still learning about and trying to refine our efforts and the skills that we need to do it better.
Thank you for that answer, Joy. Sarah?
Yeah, thanks. So Lake Crystal, Washington State has some legislative language that has already been handed to us in terms of the WHO. So in the Clean Energy Transformation Act, we have two named communities. One is what I'd call like a geographic community. So highly impacted communities is who are going to be identified through using the environmental health disparities map through the Washington State Department of Health. And so Department of Health was given the authority to create a methodology on how to use that map to identify highly impacted communities. And so it's a relative ranking system, 1 through 10. So the top 2 deciles are the ones that are being categorized as highly impacted communities based on a cumulative impact tool that was created through a public stakeholder process with a graduate student from University of Washington, a local environmental justice advocacy group, Front and Centered, as well as support from Department of Health. So we have this great tool and it uses publicly available data, but the indicators themselves are ones that were kind of chosen through this public stakeholder process. And it will continue to be used quite a bit, actually, this tool. So I'll talk about that in just a second. The other named community in Clean Energy Transformation Act is a demographic community, and it's called vulnerable populations, maybe more akin to the overburdened populations that folks have mentioned already. Vulnerable populations are those that experience disparities in terms of socioeconomic and biological health. And so that definition and who those communities will be is going to be very specific to the utility itself. So the Clean Energy Transformation Act includes a clean energy standard and a mandate that as we transition to clean energy, all customers must benefit, including an equitable distribution of benefits and reduction of burdens to highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations. Utilities are going to be responsible for defining vulnerable populations through a public stakeholder process, a public participation process. And that looks differently depending on if you're a regulated utility or not. If you're regulated by the Utilities Transportation Commission, if you're an investor-owned utility, or if you're a consumer-owned utility. And then in the Health Equity for All Act, this HEAL Act that passed, that now state agencies are the institution that need to think about the WHO, we actually are going to be, again, using this environmental health disparities map, but there will be an interagency council of staff from all the agencies that are part of this work to really understand how to evolve that tool and have it actually be used effectively for strategic environmental justice work at agencies. So the WHO is going to be developed and understood through environmental justice assessments of our programs, as well as community outreach and strategic plans. So this is a huge bill. There's a lot in here. And the other aspect is we have now an environmental justice council that includes community members, as well as a broad range of other folks that will be appointed by the governor. So we'll have community members in the process, and we'll also have state agencies trying to understand kind of these complex questions around who and how we find those communities.
You have a lot of work to do, Sarah.
We have a lot of work to do. I mean, the other piece of this I just want to say is that it's really on agencies to figure this out too. I feel like oftentimes there's this kind of blaming of communities, like you guys don't want to do this or you don't understand the opportunity. And it's on us. I'm sorry, but like we're the giant institution that really needs to figure out the who in a way, and then have that educational outreach and support, Joy, as you mentioned, to really explain what the opportunity is, and not just come in with solutions or extractive questions, but really say, hi, like, you guys might be in crisis right now. This might be the 50th thing on your list. You don't care about anything we have to say, but we want to explain why this is actually intersectional to all these other concerns that you have, and is going to support the needs in your community. So I just also wanted to put that out there.
So Rebecca, if you don't mind me jumping in, I'm back.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
So I really agree with a lot of what Sarah said, especially the last point, when we talk about who we need to target. So the first thing, people need to understand is that when we talk about disparities are systemic, they're institutional. And when I say we created them. We as a government agencies have created them. We've been complicit in creating them. So when it comes to identifying who we need to assist and who we need to help, the data is there. If we look at, health outcomes in different communities, the data is there. When we look at educational performance, the data is there. When we look at energy use, the data is there. We just have to be smart enough to put the picture together and listen to the needs of the communities when they're telling us, we're in trouble, we need this. And that's something that, I really try and make it understandable to the staff that I'm working with and that are under me, is that the information is there. And to Sarah's point, it's our responsibility to put it together, right? It's not the community's, responsibility to come up to us. We are in the business of serving the community. So we need to listen to them and serve them. So, not every state has a clean environmental justice law that makes an easy definition, but everyone has the same information. They just need to compile it and look at the big picture, look at communities that are consistently scoring low on these things, and not think of it as personal responsibility. They're just not doing what they need to do, but recognizing that the system and the institutions are failing them. So they're not even on a level playing field. So that's kind of where we're looking at, or my approach when we talk about energy equity and who we need to focus on. Because even when we have that definition in New Jersey, I focus a lot on Black and Brown communities because I know, intimately that our communities are the ones that get left behind the most, right? So for me, it's the intentional of saying that racism plays a part, so we need to look at this. Economics plays a part, so we need to look at that. And, it's just being open and honest with the state of things and trying to do our best to repair them. That's it.
I was going to say, I don't know, you can't see us, Crystal, we can't see you, but I'm feeling like that's enough of a mic drop. And our next panel is communities, and I don't want to take a moment away from it for your point. So I want to thank you all for doing this with us and for starting this conversation and being willing to jump back and forth between a speaking engagement in Newark and overcoming so many other hurdles to participate with us today. Thank you all for your time. So I'm going to close the state panel, and thank you, Joy, thank you, Sarah, thank you, Crystal, and I'm going to hand it over to Imra, who's going to introduce our next panel. Thank you. Imra, are you available to start the introduction for Stan?
Oops, yes, I was muted. Anyway, thanks a lot. That was an excellent panel, and thank all the members of the panel for illuminating the problem, the issues from the state side. As was stated several times, it's really up to us to go and ask the communities. We can't just wait for them to come to us. We have to reach out and go to them. And so the next panel is going to look at the issue from the point of view of the constituents themselves. And I would like Stan Atsiti up there. Yes, there he is. Stan, Yat-e. And it's now my pleasure to introduce my friend Stan Atsiti, who is also my program manager for power electronics. But he's more than that. He's also my guide to the Native American tribal communities. And he has helped to establish projects from the far shores of Alaska to the Navajo Nation and down south to the Seminoles. And he will moderate the next panel, which will explore energy equity from the community perspective. Stan, you're on.
Thank you, Emra. Appreciate that. Appreciate that introduction. Yeah, just like Emra said, I'm with Sandia for over 25 years, power electronics, working on some tribal energy storage projects. I myself am a member of the Navajo tribe, and I grew up on the Navajo reservation. So this whole term of energy burden, energy equity, and these terms that are around, I am personally have ties to that because I grew up in a disadvantaged community and have that perspective. So before I go on, since the tribes were mentioned, I just want to let you guys know, if you're not too familiar with the tribes, there are 574 plus tribes, federally recognized tribes in the United States. And I call it 574 plus because there are also state recognized tribes. And we are roughly about 6.75 million population, and we represent about 2% of the United States. So with that, we have this session will be focused on traditionally energy burdened communities. So we have brought together an excellent panel. So we'll be hearing perspectives from the African-American community, the Hispanic community, and the Native American communities. There are two talks. One is going to represent perspectives from the Dakota region, and the other one's from the Navajo Nation, or mainly like Southwest regions. So we have speakers here, Sergio Lopez from Verde Northwest, Reverend Michael Malcolm from Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. We have Kevin Blasser from Midwest Tribal Energy Resource Association. And finally, we have Derek Terry from Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. So what they'll do is, since we have 4 panel members, and we're going to try to maximize the Q&A session here. So I asked the panel members to quickly just introduce themselves and provide some perspectives on energy burden community, what they think and what their thoughts are, and then just kind of set the stage for everyone else. And then from there, we're going to be asking questions, and we'll move on to the Q&A session. So with that, let's move right along. We'll start off with Sergio. You're on.
Thanks, Stan. Hey, everybody. Pleasure to connect and meet you all virtually. I am here projecting, recording, going live from Portland, Oregon, Verde. We're going through a insane heat wave, if y'all haven't read yet. We have Death Valley temperature records of 114, which is unheard of out here. So if I start sweating, you know why. It's not because I'm nervous. But yeah, so my name is Sergio Lopez, Sergio Lopez, if you can't pronounce your R's, and I'm the Energy, Climate, and Transportation Coordinator at Verde. Verde, we are a nonprofit 501c3, and we build from the community up on environmental justice issues. So we essentially build social enterprise within our communities in Northeast Portland specifically and beyond for underserved communities who lack active transportation, water, food access, low-income housing. So we work on aspects not only related to policy building or legislation bills, but also grant programs for the community, essentially from the people to the people. I myself am a first generation Mexican American. Both my parents are of Mexico. I identify myself as Chicano. English is my second language. I learned that in second grade. The Spanish is my first. So I grew up in a low-income neighborhood in East LA, essentially, where my parents bought me a bike just to get to school and back. And during that process, just because they had two different jobs and couldn't drop us three kids off at once. And I think with that experience as a kid, growing up in the hood, as we'd call it, I saw a lot of things the community lacked in terms of just trying to get to school and education. And I think for me, that's how transportation became into my lens, both personally and professionally. I studied cultural anthropology here at Portland State University. So it all applied in terms of transportation is the second highest expense for a household. It's averaged at 10,000-ish per median American, meaning if you're low income, your gas, et cetera, it goes higher because you are a product of redlining and white flight, as we'd all mentioned before, post World War II. So like systematic institutional racism, et cetera, these are a product of what we're doing now with urban development, rural development, and now with the energy storage grid. It's crucial of how we move this forward. So with Verde, we take a lot of passion in building policies, programs that are going to benefit the community productively without gentrifying or with the lens of anti-displacement so that people can stay where they are from. So a little bit about, yes, and thank you for those comments on the chat. It is far more expensive, but it is a modest number. And the other two that I say it's the second highest, obviously housing is the first one and food is the third one. So all crucial amenities to just simple living. And I'll go on to the next slide. So a little bit about Verde's headquartered nonprofit office. So for those who have not been to Portland, this is an aerial view of the metro city, of the inner city. Colby is a neighborhood in Northeast Portland, very close to the airport. So if you've been to Portland, you've probably driven through not knowing. It's the highest diverse, mostly low income neighborhood located in Northeast Portland. Standing on the side that was once a native Chinook village of and I apologize for the mispronunciation here, but the near Chiquico tribe, and it was part of Multnomah County from the first European settlements in the city of Portland back from the 1980s. Colby is the highest diverse census tract in the state of Oregon. We have about over 50% of Latinx, Hispanic, or Black residents, Somalian being another one. So, if you hear the term 50% plus and you think it's not diverse, if you're living in New York or in Chicago or in LA, it's a perspective of understanding how white Portland and specifically Oregon is. So 43% of residents are reduced lunch, for example. So it's a product of redlining, it's a product of white flight. It lacks sidewalks, a lot of gravel roads. It's very rural and it's highly industrial, meaning there's a big corridor of big rigs, so high CO2 pollution. There's a lot of facilities that do glass facilities, so there's a lot of NO2 and SO2, meaning nitrogen and sulfate and sulfur. So the toxins in the air are pretty bad. So what we do is try to cater to air quality work, affordable energy, transportation. And when I say transportation, I say either active or electric, meaning it's CO2 free, it's zero emissions. And that's a lot of the work that the energy, climate, and transportation team works on specifically, and that's where I'm embedded. We also have a social enterprise of contracting firm called Verde Builds, and that's a contracting firm that constructs, builds a park. Right now we're doing current solar work, and now we're applying for grants to build capacity to get an electric truck and do electric charging stations at different sites across the state of Oregon as well. And I'll go on to the next slide and give more representation of an example. So I think in discussion of what, of this topic of, equity and energy in the grid, I think the first step that we were trying to do was with the legislation office and work with our policy bills is pushing forward these productive House bills that are a step ahead to making sure that it is equitable, that it is productively efficient for what we're trying to strive for. And the recent win that we've had here in the state of Oregon is House Bill 2475, which is the Energy Affordability Act, which is a bipartisan vote that essentially will subsidize your energy bills based on your income, which is a huge step towards, for example, solar or ductless heat pump, or electric vehicles, whatever you cater to in terms of what are the necessities and what is needed for the community at the time, or electric bikes, whatever it may be. And I think that was a pretty win considering that it wasn't just an urban vote, it was also rural Republicans voted for it. So it shows that it is not political. Energy is important. It's the future. It's what's going on now. And we all need to be on the same page on how we look at equity in terms of the grid. We're doing a lot of air quality advocacy work as well, which is putting more regulation on local polluters, such as the recycling facilities that I just mentioned, with a lot of CO2, NO2, and SO2 output into the community that are affecting people's lungs that transparently are causing cancer. And then transportation as well, focusing on finding different ways to minimize single-use vehicles, and if there's public transit, to make sure that we can find something that is more zero emission based or less emission based. And then also the TIF district, which is more reallocating of how taxes go into this neighborhood, so they can actually get allocated into productive funds that will create programs for curriculum, education, the youth, and to the base of environmental justice, and as well as grant programs, applying for grants that are going to give us capacity to install solar, install ductless heat pumps with no charge for communities to lessen their energy bill, and eventually, when electric vehicles become more equitable financially, they're very expensive. It'll be an idea of solar, ductless heat pumps, charging stations, EVs, e-bikes, no CO2. I think that's like a theoretic, beautiful world that we're thinking about. But I think in terms of CO2 and any kind of air quality work, it's crucial. And I think the grid and the energy is a huge focus on that and what we're doing right now. So that is our spiel. And I'm excited to dig more into other people's perspective across the nation, but this is what's happening here locally in Portland. And like I said, we are based in Coley, but we do work in other underserved areas in Portland. And with a contracting firm, we do work across the state of Oregon as well. So thank you all for listening. I'm excited to engage more in this next hour.
Thanks, Sergio. That was really good. Thank you for those perspectives. And we'll move right along. And the next speaker is Reverend Michael Malcolm. Reverend, you have the floor.
So I think your microphone isn't working, Reverend. Oh, I see you're on the phone. So why don't you, on your phone's phone pad, hit *6.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
There we go.
Yes.
All right, now I'm good to go. Thank you all for this opportunity to be with you all today. I want to acknowledge the Creek, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and the Chickasaw people whose land I speak from. I'd also like to honor my ancestors, my mentors, colleagues, and community whose shoulder I stand on. I'm Reverend Michael Malcolm, and I'm the founder and executive director of the People's Justice Council. And our mission is to engage and equip communities with tools and access to build power from the grassroots up to fight for change at the policy level. Our primary focus has been environmental justice and faith. The majority of our work has been around energy justice with a focus on the South. I've observed a great deal around this, ranging from community-led innovation to absurdly false solutions. I'm a proud representative of the United Church of Christ and the South. I'm also a product of a low middle income family from Atlanta, Georgia. My family is steeped in the Black church, and there are two worlds that I know very well. I know the Black church community, and I know the Black church of the South. And it is here that this knowledge that I'd like to speak from. But first thing that I need to let you know is that the Black community is not a monolith. This said, our solutions cannot be a one-size-fits-all. In the South, there are stories that are told and data that backs up these stories of energy poverty. 25% or 30.6 million face a high energy burden. This means that they pay over 6% of their income for their utilities. And 13% or 15.9% of those nationwide face a severe energy burden of more than 10% of their income. Of these 67%, 25.8 million of those low income, or of those, 67% of those are low-income households, and they face a high energy burden, while 60% or 15.4 million of those who are low-income households have a high energy burden, facing a severe energy burden. And this is energy poverty, and it's concentrated in the South. And here's how. The East South Central region, that's Alabama, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Tennessee, have the highest percentage of household energy burdens, 38% of them, compared to the other regions. However, with all of this data, energy burden and energy poverty is a solid balance in the South. It is rarely addressed. It is rarely thought of. It is rarely spoken of. It has not really been something that has been addressed as a part of the promises of addressing vulnerable communities. However, there are solutions, and if I can get the next slide. Here's a solution that, and I told you I have some powerful mentors and colleagues whose shoulder I stand on, and one of them is Shalonda Baker. And in her book, matter of fact, in her book, Revolutionary Power, she talks about one of the solutions being love. Leading with love. For us in the United Church of Christ, we would say that was a love for community, a love for children, and a love for the cosmos, or a love for the planet. A love for community. If we are going to have energy solutions, there are two things that our energy solutions must do. The benefits need to go to the communities or to the most vulnerable, those who are suffering the most. But secondly, not just the benefits need to go to those who are most vulnerable, but also the investment needs to go to those who are most vulnerable. The only way that we can truly solve the conditions that we're in is if everyone can economically benefit and we can rid ourselves of poverty. Energy poverty is, again, one of our silent killers in the South. Long before George Floyd said that he couldn't breathe, Black folk in the South were saying they can't breathe because of their energy burdens. A love for children. Not only does our solutions to get rid of these energy burdens and help our community, not only are they solutions for those households, but there are solutions for a planet. And if there are solutions for a planet, there are also solutions for a generation to come. Because if we can lower the emissions, if we can lower the energy use, we can lower the emissions, and we can help to save this planetary disruption that we're in. And a love for cosmos. Again, addressing energy burdens amongst our people will also help our planet. There are two things that we do with the People's Justice Council in Alabama, Interfaith Power and Light that lead with love. One of the things that we do is we rise, which is weatherizing every resident in the Southeast. As we go throughout the programs that we look at weatherization in, there are two things that stand out. One is the process of being able to access those programs are incredibly hard for those who are already under-resourced and underserved. The second thing that you need to hear in that is that it doesn't address those who need it most. When you look at it, most of these programs doesn't address renters. Renters are often locked out of these weatherization programs. And if you look at the statistics, 90% of land wealth has been lost by Black Americans. Guess who are most of the renters are? It would be those who are already most vulnerable. And those are the ones who have to pay in addition for their energy burdens. We lead with love. by not just addressing weatherization to those who can afford it, not just those who own the home, but also those who rent as well. We want to connect with communities of faith because we also believe that communities of faith and our Leading with Love are ambassadors for Leading with Love. It can show a sample, an example of how to enforce this Leading with Love throughout community by addressing weatherization as a community outreach. And the reason why it's important for us to address weatherization first is because we can put all of the storage and all of the panels on each home and in each community. But if people are still losing because they are continuing to heat up the outside and cool down the outside, we've only addressed a part of the issue. People will still starve the same. We'll just replace the system that they're in. If we're going to truly address those who are most vulnerable, we've got to change the system, or at least address the cracks in the system. One of our lowest hanging fruits is weatherization. The other thing that we have in our Leading with Love is speaking truth to power. And this is where we are also getting faith leaders involved to be advocates for justice and advocates for those who are in community who suffer the most. We believe that in our Leading with Love, we are also helping to cultivate creation and creation care. Thank you for my time, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Reverend. Appreciate that insight. Very, very good. Setting the stage for questions. Kevin Blasser is our next speaker. Kevin, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm Kevin Blazer. I'm the Vice Chairman of the MTERA, which is the Midwest Tribal Energy Resources Association. We're a group that is comprised of representatives from the tribes in the Midwest, and we're involved with a lot of the energy projects that are happening and trying to share the information. You could roll one slide, please. So MTERA's mission is to help empower tribes to manage their energy resources through collective action and information sharing and the things that we can do together. So you've got, on one side, you've got tribal sovereignty, which is a little bit different than some of the other disadvantaged communities, and that tribal governments are federally recognized and they have power over their own communities. So you're always going to have these tribal sovereignties of each individual member tribe. And as Stan said earlier, that there's 576, 574 of federally recognized tribes, plus all of the state recognized tribes, and then the Alaskan Native corporations, the Hawaiian indigenous peoples. So there's a lot of these groups that are part of that. And then the collective strength of all of the tribes. So while each tribe is different, there are certain things, particularly in the energy space, that are, can represent collective action. And that's kind of where MTERA is involved. The energy markets are unique and is unlike kind of the gaming markets that a lot of people understand, mostly think of tribes as operators of gaming and entertainment facilities. Gaming markets are competing for a limited amount of patrons that have dollars that they're going to spend in those entertainment facilities. So tribes are competing between each other to capture that kind of revenue, because that's really the only revenue the tribes can have. But with energy, everybody can participate, and it's not a zero-sum game. So by sharing that information and working together, particularly with the bigger projects, I mean, energy is one sector that is very dependent on economies of scale. The bigger you make these deals, the bigger you make these projects, the more benefits can be distributed across not only the tribal community, but also the communities that are ancillary or next to a lot of these tribal areas. So that's what MTERA was designed to do. The organization's been around for 5 or 6 years. We're just starting to get a lot of kind of core tribes and kind of a critical mass to now we're getting involved with a lot more of the government laboratories, trying to analyze these pieces and take the data and create actionable items. So we're going from identifying issues, kind of understanding what the data sets are, collecting all of that information, and then trying to distill it down into how can we take this and how can we do something with it. And if you could roll one more slide, please. So when we're looking at, kind of stored energy, particularly, and this is probably a little bit more granular, and this is, more implementation as opposed to theoretical. A lot of stored energy has a unique opportunity in the marketplace, and we need to understand the economics of what it can do. There are two big orders that FERC has handed down. For those of you playing along at home, if you want to really read all these hundreds of pages of orders, but there's 841 and 2222. So 841 is how stored energy is implemented by a regional transmission operator and their independent system operator, which are these big bulk power system managers. And 2222 is how distributed energy is going to be integrated into those markets. So we really need to understand the economics and the pricing signals for how these projects can be deployed, because ultimately that's the economics. I mean, there are lots of government opportunity and there's a lot of grant programs to get these projects started, but by and large, they're going to have to succeed in a market. So the government fiat can get you so far, but they have to be kind of self-sustaining after a certain point. And the biggest problem with stored energy is that people are trying to take existing framework and jam stored energy into it. The current kind of model is a big base load generation, and that is sent on wires to the load center at the same time it's generated. But stored energy really doesn't do that. It's not truly generation, it's not truly a load subject. It's more of a catch and release of kind of these electrons. So if you're over generating at one time, you're capturing it to distribute, to release it back out to power things at a later date. So you've got time shift, you've got peak shaving, to where there's all sorts of different things you can do. But the problem is that these orders are so new, these regional transmission managers haven't created the market yet. So the economics are still a little bit unclear. So there's not a lot of people that are willing to dive in and throw a lot of capital at this, because there's no way really of quantifying precisely exactly how you're going to get your money back, which is different than a gas generation peaker plant or some of the other more traditional forms of generation or assets that are within the energy markets. The other thing that's unique about stored energy is that you've got a bigger opportunity of deploying this more broadly. So you don't need thousands of acres to put a solar farm on. You don't need a giant chunk of land next to a transmission for some base load generation. You can put it out, it has a smaller footprint. So you can put it out into different places, and you've got the opportunity to build kind of private partnership solutions where a community could create kind of a neighborhood charity, and then the developer could work with that and really, kind of share some of the economics. So as opposed to just having somebody come in and drop an energy project in and then work with the community after the fact, you coming in earlier in the plant and you're bringing the neighborhood in and you're organizing that to kind of share some of the economics. And when you start sharing the economics and you start working with the community, you've got a lot less of the not in my backyard issues that come up, where a project forced onto a community is going to have a lot more resistance than the community is excited about it and dragging a project through. You also have the ability to start scaling these projects where if something works in a community, the community can then decide, oh, we can build this larger and capture more economics. So you're putting together this framework to make this thing successful. The other part is just, building these revenue sharing models or coming up with the concepts. There's a process that probably not a lot of people understand. It's called the securitization of costs. If in Michigan, we see it on our electric bills where, you've got one line item that's securitization of a particular project. You can do the same things. You've just got to work with the regulatory agencies and create that framework. because if you can securitize those costs and have those costs in that project identified, it becomes a more bankable asset. And that way you can attract cheaper capital. So your cost of capital can be reduced, allowing for the better economics for these projects. But you've got to be able to bundle them, identify them, and then be able to isolate those costs and show those to a financing agent, and then you'll be able to capture some of those additional benefits from doing that. Another part which we see that we're working with, as MTerra, and we're trying to put all these things together, is the state regulatory framework is kind of a patchwork. It's not all the same. So a tribe in Minnesota is going to be treated differently than a tribe in Michigan, or a community in Iowa is going to be treated differently than one in Wisconsin. So there's a patchwork, and a lot of it is, state wants to mandate its own process. But it's to some certain extent, FERC could mandate, some level of standardization. And that's kind of what they're trying to do at some levels with the 841 and the 2222 bills is, say, all right, there's going to be a process for putting these distributed assets into your RTO system, but it's up to you to determine exactly how that's going to be implemented. And that's where the community stakeholder really needs to become involved, because if it can, if there's some base standardization or some base process, then everybody kind of knows the basic rules, and you're just changing rules on the margin to fit each individual need. So it's not, as Reverend said, it's not a monolithic solution. It's not one size fits all, but if you've got a framework to do the base, then you can have all the different solutions where people now understand it. So you don't have to have this giant regulatory burden where you need a law degree and years of experience to understand even the rules by which you play by. So that can kind of help, implement some of these processes. And again, just underserved communities, being part of the rulemaking process. A lot of times these underserved communities are the last to know of a deal. The developers working with the regulatory agency is working with the state, is working with the financing, and then they have all that put together, and then they tell the community, oh yeah, we got this project, we're going to get it approved in 10 days, and it's going to land in your community. It's something that kind of adds a little bit more friction than it needs to be, but that's the system that's set up. Being able to change that and move the communities, and part of the primary rulemaking, they'll be able to say when they need to get involved, and they'll be able to put that framework in place, and the developers will know. I mean, I've talked to a bunch of developers that, even local governments going from city to city or township to township or county to county, the rules are all different, and it makes it difficult for them to build a big project that spans a number of these local governments because it's so chaotic in some places. Kind of the other thing that, when we were going through the thought exercise of, looking forward in these markets is creating better tax incentives. I mean, there's a lot of these communities that, if you're making $15,000 a year, you don't need a tax incentive. You're not really paying that many taxes anyway. It's not that valuable to you. But if your community owned that tax incentive and could sell it to somebody that was a higher tax incentive, all of a sudden that becomes a community asset that's worth a lot more than an individual asset. And a lot of these programs are geared towards individual taxpayers or individual entities. And if we could create something to where the tax credits are almost tradable, so a community could say, all right, we're going to create this tax and we're going to sell this tax incentive for this project, and we're going to invest in playgrounds and schools and early learning and all of whatever gaps that they happen to have. You could funnel those tax dollars into the community and make it, really make that project successful, because then the project owner would have these tax credits, the community would have an ability to monetize them and really extract all of the value from them. And now you're putting a lot of that stuff to really good work. The other part that, we struggle with all the time from a tribal staff standpoint, just speaking as my job as part of economic development of a tribal community, the grant process is onerous. I mean, there's, thousands of papers to do some of these things. and there you put all this money and investment into these applications, and you're not guaranteed that they're going to win. Now, not every project should win. A lot of them should be on a competitive basis, but I think there has to be an easier way of being able to access some of these non-equity, non-debt funding sources with even just a concept. So that way you can say, okay, this is either going to work or it's not going to work. If it's going to work and we have a high percentage of winning, then it makes sense to invest all the time and money in putting together a 200-300 page application. If it's not, tell me what we're doing wrong and how we can move these things. We can move these things around or adjust our business plan or our project plan in order to get access to these dollars, in order to funnel them into the highest use, highest return projects that really benefit these communities. And I think if, even if we did some parts of these and moved a few of these things forward, you're going to have a lot better outcome. You're going to have a more equitable distribution of the returns, but also the costs, and you'll have more community buy-in and really be able to grow these things. And with that, I think we're really looking forward to having the conversation and trying to hammer out some of these ideas. So thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Very good perspective on a number of different orders, FERC orders, and integration challenges and all that. So let's finish off with our last panelist, Derek Terry out of the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. So giving his viewpoint on it. Derek, you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me, Stan?
Yes, we can hear you okay.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon. There might be some good mornings also wrapped around in there. But I did talk to Dr. Juk earlier this morning. He gave me a good yate, which was a form as a greeting in Navajo of hello. So let me bid everybody a yate. This is Derek Terry from the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. I am a member of the Navajo Nation as well as an employee for the NTUA here. And from the slide, I'm the renewable energy specialist here. So we're primarily the boots on the ground of all, I believe, from all the talks that are happening today. And so we try to get, things in motion to try to get to the end user and how that goes. So in a brief, update of how N2A works is that we've had a wonderful relationship now, a working relationship with Sandia National Laboratories for the past, I would say, 30 years, maybe the late 1980s or so, in which we implemented our first systems, and Sandia has always been there as a helpful hand and assistance to helping us, guide us and teach us. So we thank Sandia very much for their guidance over the years and their continued support to us with Navajo as well as the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority. So we appreciate that and welcome everybody on the presentation today. And thank you for taking time. I know time is very precious, so we appreciate it. So you can go to the next slide, Stan. So before we get further, I'm going to introduce myself in Navajo. So my name is Derek Terry. My clans are Tsitnajini and Twamahe, and my grandfather's clans are Maidishkijni and Tsanjikine. So as Navajo, you want to introduce yourself in your native way. So I just did that and just let you know that I am Navajo and I'm here presenting to you. So thank you. So with us, with Navajo Nation and the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, is that we have a renewable, energy program here with us. And so what we do is we try to, offer families that don't have, the means of electricity, and we try to give them electricity by the way of renewable energy. So from the slide, you'll be able to see some off-grid portable island systems that we make available. So before I dive into it a little bit further, the next slide will cover a little bit more description of those systems. But with our program itself, what we try to do is we try to promote renewable energy as much as we can here on Navajo. The way we do that is we go out and we reach out to the community. We try to get a hold of, the youngest people out there, which are our students. So we're a big advocate in the school systems. as well as in the community. So the Navajo Nation itself, is broken up into 110 community chapter areas that cover 27,000 square miles that make up the Navajo Nation. So it's a really, really big, area in which we have to serve. The Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, is the majority utility service within the area. So we try to get out there and, make a namesake for us in the community level. So with that, we also try to be an example for other Native communities out there. I know some are small, some are large, so somewhere in between. And they try to reach out to us in certain areas and facets and see what we're doing. And we try to share as much as we can with them by ways of what our program is, the lessons learned, so that they can learn from us to try to run their program even better than we do, in the end. And then we also try to teach, efficiency in our Navajo members' lives, as well as stress the importance of it. So with us here on Navajo, the average from the last, notes that I've received is that the average medium income is about 10,700 per annual year. So that's not very much. So what we have to do is we have to really make it a point in which we stress energy efficiency. So as a result, keep a little bit more money in their pocket as much as they can, and make it stretch, because a lot of our families are in pretty dire straits, and we want to try to help them as much as we can, using solar, using wind energy, and then at the same time saving money, so that they can use it in different areas of their lifestyle. So next. So with us, one facet of our renewable energy program is we provide off-grid solar option for electrification. So some of these families, they fall into that area in which they just live way too far away from the normal grid power, connection. And these are miles and miles away of rough terrain, unmaintained roads, you got canyons, you got washes. And so these families have been there for decades and decades. So they're not really apt to moving into the city or established community areas. So what they want to do is stay out there. So we try to give them that option, with the way of renewable energy, with these off-grid systems, and keep them there. That's where they're comfortable, that's where they want to be, and that's where they establish their lifestyle. So with these systems, we're able to do that. Currently, within our group, we have 502 of these off-grid systems. They're large enough to run, depending on the size of the unit. The largest we have is an 18 cubic foot refrigerator, as well as a smaller 10 cubic foot refrigerator. Then as well as trying to, run your smaller items, which would be your lights, your illumination type devices, your small personal devices, as well as small kitchen appliances. So we try to give them the opportunity to run those particular devices. But as always, when you're trying to run larger things, which is, your electric range and water heater, and always get the call for heating systems, large HVAC type systems. And for us that know solar, those are really a big hit on our battery systems. And they always, have an issue of them going down right away. So we try to educate our families as much as we can to limit those devices. Oh yes, I wanted to make a point that a lot of these families, they won't be able to get grid power to them just because of the cost of conventional building. And the cost has just skyrocket over the years, and then especially now with the way things are with our building products, is that some places, you're looking at 3 to 4-fold of the prices going up. And so your quotes are going higher and higher. So this makes the advantage to our customers is that it makes them completely, I see typo on the bottom there. So our customers are completely energy independent. So they have their own systems. So in an event of an outage, they have power to their refrigerator as well as their lights. So, and as a result, we keep the Navajo Nation looking clean and natural and great for us to for our customers to enjoy for many more years down the road. So I did get a question, emphasize the education of youth. So what we do is we go all the way down to, kindergartners all the way up to the higher grades. And then we get the invitation to go out to, our community college here on Navajo, as well as the local universities, which would be ASU, U of A, NAU, and our newly Crown Point Technical University. So we go out there and we try to reach and get partnership with them. We try to get internships on board with us. We teach them what we do. So with the whole point of, getting their hands, onto these systems and working on them and taking them right at the first-hand approach, so that they see the first family getting hooked up to solar, and then you see the joys in their eyes as they turn on the electricity for the first time, as they get lights, as we install the refrigerator for them. So it's very powerful at that moment, and even at the point when they're running their gives them ability to get internet access. So what the whole point, I've heard a few times from our previous slides, was that there's energy burdens. Here on Navajo, yes, there is an energy burden, but it goes way beyond that. There's more issues that are involved, to the point that you need infrastructure set in place, you need housing set in place. There's lots of things, and we're a small component to that. So, okay, that's all I had for now. Let me see. Can we do the next slide if there's any? I don't think I had. Oh, so right now we have a whole group of 3. So I got my supervisor here, Donovan Begay, myself, as well as my counterpart, Joe Donajon. So us 3 are taking a huge challenge and trying to remotely power up, the Navajo Nation with boots on the ground and getting them off-grid power. So with that, I thank you. I know we can talk about this all day, but I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Derek. Yeah, just thank Derek for coming and speaking to us. So yeah, let's use the last part of the time to address some of these questions. This is a panel, so let's just get right into it. I want to ask the panel, everyone, this question. So since this whole workshop or roundtable is energy storage for social equity, energy storage. So how can energy storage asset create value for disadvantaged community? So what are your thoughts there? Let's spend some time on that. Anybody chime in?
Well, I guess I'll go first. I think that energy storage equity or energy storage could provide benefit for community by way of them having access to their own power. And by giving them access to their power and the benefits thereof economically, it can help to build wealth within the community.
Okay.
If you were to take and a lot of these individual rooftop solar installations in a community, particularly probably more dense urban community, if you were to take all of that solar power, run it through the battery system, you'd have a community that would be able to engage in peak shaving, as also if they have any extra energy, you could sell it at opportunistic times. You're converting what is normally an expense or an expense avoidance into a revenue source. And once you take infrastructure assets and make those income producing, you're going to have some increase in wealth. So converting all of this infrastructure that typically represents an expense line item, moving that to revenue, now you've got ability to do that. And again, it most likely is going to happen at scale. There's going to be some needs, some community leadership, probably going to be some initial capital, and then just setting up those concepts of, basically creating almost small little co-ops for every neighborhood, and not only distributing the energy generation, but also distributing the command and control of those assets to the community, as opposed to centralizing it in one state regulatory agency or a couple of large incumbent utilities.
Okay, excellent. Sergio, you had something.
Glad as well to comment that you, sorry, Reverend Michael.
I'm sorry. Real quick, Sergio, I also wanted to say in that it also gives stability of the grid as well. So the issues that we saw in Texas are a little bit harder when you got energy stored up. So I just wanted to add that in as well.
Okay, Sergio?
Yeah, I think from our experiences within our neighborhoods is, I mean, you're like what's mentioned here before, like the self-sufficiency of your own neighborhoods. And I think, and that's building economic capacity, that is building economic wealth. And that right there is an ingredient of anti-displacement policies that are going to keep these people where they're from, where they want to be. And I think that right there has a bigger picture in terms of, displacing and going down that road. But it's a self-sufficient microgrid that, and I think also what Reverend Michael just mentioned is what happened in Texas and not going into the grid. And I mean, I'm sitting here in 114-degree weather right now, and when the winter, it's the opposite. It snows here now, it's heat waves, that's not normal. And I think with the process of climate change, it's very crucial.
And, it builds a sense of community. If the community knows it owns this asset, you're going from, isolated individual people, you're bringing a sense of community. And I think that's one of the things that, at least in my experience in some of these more disadvantaged, particularly urban neighborhoods, that sense of community has been lost. This brings it back together. And then you're creating a place where people want to stay and live. So when you're doing that, you're increasing the values of those properties. And you're creating that sense of, hey, this is a cool community to live in. We want to stay here. We don't want to just run at the next opportunity. They want to stay and they want to continue to build that. So you're creating both, identifiable monetary wealth, but also a lot of that intangible wealth that's more difficult to measure. But it's kind of, it when you see it, or you get that sense of community a lot of those times.
Interesting. So Kevin, you had mentioned some of the tax incentives in your presentation. You're representing some of the tribes in that area. As you know, one of the challenges we have with tribal communities is tax. We don't pay tax. So therefore, having those incentives, and some of those cannot be available to deploy some of these systems. How do we go about that? I mean, do we have to be reliant on federal funding to if we can't take care of or if we can't take advantage of some of those incentives?
Well, I think and that's one of the things that MTER is trying to work on as well, just as an organization. But I think individually, with the tribe that I work for, the Saginaw Chippewa tribe of Michigan, we've been looking at it as how can we bring developers in, and the tribe contributes some amount of capital to the project, but the developer or a taxable entity can capture the tax advantageness of that and then use that as part of their financing stack. So we're trying to create new ways of doing that. And there are some mechanisms of the new market tax credits, but those districts, you have to be lucky enough to be in one. Our qualified opportunity zones are another one, but you have to be lucky enough that the governor of your state has identified a community as an opportunity zone. So it's kind of hit and miss. There's a lot more political process in that. But also, working with the qualified opportunity zone fund manager and getting them to understand these energy projects in the disadvantaged area as well as tribal areas is something a little bit different. I've talked to a number of the fund managers that I've met or run across, and a lot of them seem to be more predisposed to multifamily housing on the East Coast. Not to say that multifamily housing on the East Coast is bad, but it doesn't help me generate income and wealth off of energy projects in a remote area of the upper Midwest. And that just kind of that dislocation of information and how to understand how to work with tribes, the advantages that tribes bring to the equation. And that's, I think I spend the majority of my time just helping people understand what a tribal community is and how the advantages of being sovereign, self-determination, all of those advantages can be utilized to develop some of these projects. And that's, again, another kind of mission spoke of Mterra is to help the outside, non-tribal world understand that, and then be kind of a portal of all that information to make it easier for everybody and just try to reduce as many frictions to these projects as possible. Because, on their own, they're complicated to begin with. And as soon as you start doing them, like everything else, it's going to get way more complicated all on its own. So we can do some things on the front end to make it less complicated, knowing that it's going to take on a life of its own downstream. We can just help move these things through and make a good outcome. Because that's really what we're all trying to do, is what are the highest ROI projects we can have that have the most impact and the broadest base of population. Because when things are successful and all boats rise, everybody works better, and all these things are successful. And I've used this before, is just nobody gets fired because the project was too successful. I mean, that's kind of one of the metrics that we look at as well.
Reverend, you have a question?
Yeah, Stan, I'd like to make sure that we keep equity in our that is in the topic or in the theme in here. And as Kevin is talking about ROI, or return on investment, I'd like to make sure that the audience whom I'm speaking with understands that return on investment, unless it comes back to that community, it's inequitable. We can have a system where, again, we put solar on people's houses, we can put solar storage, but if they're still heating up the outside and cooling down the outside, they aren't saving money. If we don't do weatherization, if we don't make this energy, the benefit, economic benefit of the energy accessible to them, we are simply replacing an unjust system with a cleaner, unjust system. We've got to change the system in order for this to work properly. And that starts with us looking at where the healing needs to take place first, and then branching out from there. Thank you.
Very well put. Thank you for mentioning that, by the way, because we do need to get back to the equity equation and how do we maximize benefit for the community itself, focus on the community. So that's fantastic. Sergio, maybe let's say we have one more. Rebecca, we're going to have to shift over to the next panel, right? Pretty soon. I can't hear you.
Stan, you are the last panel of the day, so you have the privilege of when and how you choose to end.
Oh, we could probably go for another 2 hours. I've got tons of questions here. This is going very well. So I'm excited about the panel and discussion, but we are respectful of people's time, though. We do need to.
Brother Stan, I got some praying to do. I don't know if I want to do 2 hours.
That sounds good, Reverend. I appreciate that. So Sergio, you're going to say something real quick, and then otherwise we're going to have to start summing this up.
I do want to add, finish it off saying that, within a lot of the programs that we are working with, like solar and charging infrastructure and the grid, we have programs within the community with community cohorts that help the community members, specifically Hispanic Latinx, to build capacity to understand the air pollution controls, how the regulators work with, for us is DEQ, which is the Department of Environmental Quality, to give them the capacity of skill sets to organize, communicate properly in these intimidating rooms with state regulators to speak for the community on the community. Testimonials that are going above and beyond on what they want to hear. There's data, and now there's community anecdotes that are providing these really strong testimonials on these things that are gonna, that are an ingredient, and they are a variable to the equation of this topic. So, and I did want to add that it's more so there's programs, there's policies, but there's also community building. And I think that's a sense of, as we refer to, self-sufficient community of equity.
Fantastic. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. Lots of good topics, a lot of good presentation. And with Derek's perspective, Reverend Kevin and Sergio, thank you so much for your perspective and what you do for the community. I'm so indebted to you for doing that, having the heart to reach out to the community and to make a difference. So I really appreciate that. So With that, I think this pretty much ends this panel session, and thank you everyone, panel members, for contributing all that. So I appreciate it. Rebecca, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I have to say, Stan, that that last 10 minutes of your panel, that might have rivaled this or exceeded the Secretary of Energy as like the take-home clip for this whole event. So that made me feel amazing just to listen to you guys kind of draw these big connections. And I think it really helps us imagine what the future could look like. So thank you all for those comments. This is the end of day one of our event. There is a day two. Tomorrow will be featuring Walea Johns, also from the Navajo, who's now a senior advisor at the Office of Indian Energy within the Department of Energy. I'm really excited to hear her remarks about where she's taking that organization. We'll also have a presentation on sort of advanced technology development to simplify how these systems work from an engineering perspective so that they become more accessible for communities to access and use well in remote locations. And then we'll have two more panels, one that's featuring more discussion of the utility business model and some of the ways that they've tried to innovate to accomplish more equity in their work. And then we'll finally wrap around with an ending panel that's thinking really specifically about energy storage and grid improvements like energy storage and how they can be done to advance some of these issues. So we may even have a surprise ender. I'm still working on that on the side, but I'll send out a note to all of the registrants to see. I think we'll have a fantastic speaker closing us out tomorrow as well. So thank you all for your attention. I hope to see you tomorrow at the same time. Be in touch if you have any questions. Imra, any last notes that you'd like to raise to close us out here?
I would like to add my thanks to the panel. The communities are, after all, what we have to address in this program. It's not a scholastic program. It's a program that is meant to effect change. And I hope we can call upon you as we build out this program and go into some actual practical projects in the field and involving communities. Since the Reverend Malcolm brought it up, I would also like to mention that we are well aware of Shalanda Baker's work. In fact, I cribbed a few of her graphs in my presentations at the beginning. And she's, of course, now in the Secretary's office, pushing the concept of energy equity. And we had, in fact, asked her to give the introductory address in this workshop, but unfortunately she was not able to do that because she has loads of other commitments at the moment, but she's well aware of us. So thank you all, and hopefully we will see all of you tomorrow, well rested and eager to take on new tasks.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. It was fun.